Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're going to step deep into the hidden chambers of Europe's royal palaces, places where bloodlines were prized more than love, and where generations of kings and queens paid the ultimate price for keeping their power pure. This isn't just history, this is a centuries-long story of obsession, vanity, and decay, where the pursuit of divine lineage turned into a slow, genetic downfall. From the haunted halls of the Spanish Habsburgs to the fragile heirs of the Bourbons and the doomed czars of Russia, these are the most inbred families that shaped Europe's destiny. So grab a seat, dim the lights, and let's unravel the tangled web of royal bloodlines and the dark secrets behind them. And hey, if you enjoy diving into history's hidden corners and forbidden truths, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell so you never miss a midnight story like this one again. Alright, let's begin our journey. Long before the rise of sprawling empires and glittering courts, the idea of noble blood carried weight beyond mere lineage. Across medieval Europe, kings and queens believed that their veins coursed with something divine, something that set them apart from the common people who tilled their lands and served their courts. To be born of royal blood was not just a privilege, it was a mandate, a cosmic right to rule. And with that right came the unyielding obsession to preserve it, to shield it from what they called taint, whether from alliances with distant houses or, heaven forbid, common folk. This obsession found its roots in the chaotic aftermath of the fall of Rome. Europe was splintered into countless fiefdoms, each led by warlords, dukes, and counts. Amid this fragmentation, marriage became the sharpest weapon and the most delicate art. A well-placed bride could secure peace, claim territory, or fortify a dynasty for centuries. But these unions were never simple matters of love or attraction. They were contracts inked in blood, codified through heraldry and ceremony, designed to keep the power concentrated in the hands of a few families. Every marriage, every union, was a calculated move on a chessboard that spanned the continent. By the 12th century, the principle of noble purity had solidified into a near-religious obsession. The Church, paradoxically both protector and enabler of these dynasties, sanctioned marriages between cousins, sometimes even first cousins, under the banner of necessity. Canon law could bend political will, and in many cases dispensations were granted without hesitation. The higher the rank, the more exemptions they seemed to merit. Princes and princesses were pawns, yes, but also treasured vessels of a bloodline that was thought to be sacred, even incorruptible. It was during this period that dynasties like the Habsburgs began their meticulous, almost fanatical construction of interlocking marriages. Austria's Habsburgs, originally counts in the shadow of larger kingdoms, realised early that territorial expansion through war was costly and fragile. Diplomacy, orchestrated through marriage, promised stability and far-reaching influence without drawing a sword. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry, became their unspoken creed. Each marriage was a carefully plotted merger of territories and titles, but it was also a tightening loop of genetic consequence that would echo through generations. Even as Europe's political landscape grew more elaborate, so too did the visual culture surrounding these dynasties. Portraiture, coins, and ceremonial regalia were all deployed to reinforce the myth of divine perfection. Kings were shown in statuesque poses, often idealized, with no hint of weakness. Queens were painted with flawless skin, serene expressions, and halos of light in certain cases, subtle visual cues meant to imply holiness. Yet, beneath the surface, the human cost of these unions was growing. Infertility, deformities, and premature deaths were quietly whispered about in palace corridors but rarely recorded in public annals. To admit that a royal child might be weak, sickly, or mentally impaired risked scandal, political instability, and even invasion. Still, the dynasties pressed forward, convinced that their meticulous genealogical engineering was necessary. Each new marriage was a calculation. A cousin married to a cousin, a nephew betrothed to a niece, a distant branch brought in to reinforce the main line. It was not uncommon for the same bloodlines to circle back on themselves multiple times within a few generations. What they believed was preserving purity was, in fact, concentrating inherited weaknesses. Yet for those at the courts, the allure of divine right and political advantage far outweighed any whisper of danger. Across the continent, other families watched and often emulated the Habsburgs. In France, the Bourbons began their own intricate web of alliances. England too saw the Tudor and later Stuart lines arrange marriages not just for diplomacy, but for survival. Scandinavia's ruling houses, though smaller in number, engaged in similar practices, reinforcing what had become an almost universal aristocratic doctrine. Power belonged to the few, and that power required carefully monitored blood. The obsession was not purely political or strategic. It had a psychological and spiritual component as well. Many monarchs truly believed that their blood carried divine favour, and to dilute it with the common or even distant noble blood was sacrilege. This belief shaped how they treated their families, their heirs, and even their subjects. Children born into these lines were both treasured and trapped, expected to carry the mantle of a divine mission, even as they were unknowingly burdened with generations of concentrated genetic risk. To live and rule as royalty was paradoxically to be both exalted and doomed. By the late 14th and early 15th centuries, this obsession had transformed Europe into a continent of interwoven bloodlines, each dynasty a carefully maintained lattice of power and inheritance. Some of these unions produced rulers who were brilliant and charismatic, capable of shaping history in remarkable ways. Others bore the seeds of tragedy, illness, and premature decline. It became a strange mixture of awe and horror. The public could marvel at the elegance and regality of their monarchs, while remaining oblivious to the silent toll that centuries of intermarriage were exacting from the very people meant to embody perfection. And so, the stage was set. Dynasties rose and fell, empires expanded and contracted, all while the invisible, relentless force of their own bloodlines worked in secret. What the Habsburgs, Bourbons, Tudors, and other royal families did not yet understand was that nature has its own laws, indifferent to human ambition. No matter how gilded the throne or adorned the crown, biology would always exact a price for these obsessive attempts at purity. Some would realize it too late, when heirs failed, bodies faltered, and centuries of calculated marriages unravelled into tragedy. Others would only see it in portraits, in whispered rumours, or in the pale, fragile children who bore the weight of too many shared ancestors. Among the dynasties that mastered this delicate art of power, the Habsburgs stand out as both the most successful and the most cautionary. Emerging from the modest county of Habsburg in the 11th century, they quickly learned that swords could win battles, but marriages could win empires. By the 15th century, their reach stretched across Austria, Spain, the Low Countries, and beyond. Each strategic union was not merely a political decision, it was a deliberate act of blood engineering. The Habsburg motto, though often whispered rather than formally declared, became a guiding principle: marry or be swallowed by the ambitions of others. This meticulous planning was evident in the marriages of Frederick III, Holy Roman Emperor. Frederick's union with Eleanor of Portugal secured critical alliances with Iberian territories, while his insistence on close-kin marriages ensured the consolidation of the Habsburg claim to the throne across generations. His children would marry into powerful houses across Europe, forming a web that stretched from Spain to the Netherlands. The deliberate repetition of cousin marriages, sometimes first cousins, sometimes more distant but still within the same elite circles, became a hallmark of the dynasty. And while the political gains were undeniable, the genetic consequences were already beginning to manifest. By the 16th century, the physical and mental effects of concentrated bloodlines were subtly creeping into royal courts. Portraits of Habsburg heirs began to show subtle signs of elongated jaws, prominent foreheads, and other facial traits that would later become infamous. observers in the court noted that certain children were weaker, less robust, or more prone to illness than their predecessors. While contemporaries attributed these ailments to divine testing, harsh climates, or the vicissitudes of fate, modern analysis reveals the unmistakable imprint of inbreeding, the kind that would later culminate in the tragic life of Charles II of Spain. Yet, the Habsburgs were not alone in this obsessive pursuit. Across Europe, other dynasties followed similar paths, often unaware of or indifferent to the biological risks. In France, the House of Bourbon meticulously arranged marriages to maintain political stability and reinforce claims to neighbouring thrones. The English Tudors, though fewer in number, often engaged in politically expedient unions designed to consolidate power after decades of civil strife. Even the Scandinavian monarchies, isolated in their northern realms, understood that preserving the purity of their royal lines was more important than expanding territory through warfare. Across the continent, a silent, invisible law was emerging. The closer the bloodlines, the greater the risk, yet the allure of concentrated power was irresistible. This obsession was reinforced by a potent combination of religion, superstition, and art. Church authorities frequently blessed marriages between cousins, sometimes even more closely related, provided that the union served the greater political good. Papal dispensations became routine, often granted with the implicit understanding that the preservation of dynastic bloodlines was a sacred task. Meanwhile, court artists were tasked with presenting an image of divine perfection. Portraits exaggerated symmetry, smoothed over imperfections, and subtly idealized features to give the illusion of faultless lineage. Every depiction reinforced the idea that these rulers were semi-divine, chosen by heaven, and protected from the flaws that afflicted ordinary humanity. But behind the gilded facades, the consequences were accumulating. The more these families concentrated their blood, the more genetic vulnerabilities accumulated. Infertility became a growing concern, often whispered about in private court documents or letters. Miscarriages, stillbirths, and childhood illnesses were rampant, yet rarely publicly acknowledged. This silent attrition of vitality threatened the very purpose of dynastic obsession, producing heirs who could continue the line. It was a delicate dance, maintain purity without destroying the line entirely. The balance was fragile, and history would soon show how easily it could tip toward catastrophe. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, chroniclers and diplomats began noting the peculiar patterns of illness and deformity among certain royal families. Some remarked on the so-called Habsburg jaw, a protruding lower jaw that would later become emblematic of the dynasty. Others documented cases of weak or sickly heirs who could not fulfill the physical or intellectual expectations of rulership. Yet, rather than abandoning their practices, dynasties often doubled down, convinced that the blessings of heaven would outweigh the burdens of biology. The illusion of divine favour was stronger than any empirical observation, and it was this illusion that allowed the cycle to continue generation after generation. In tandem with these physical consequences, the psychological and social ramifications were profound. Children of royal blood were simultaneously idolised and burdened. They were expected to embody the perfection of their lineage, while navigating courts that were often treacherous and politically charged. The pressure was immense, and many suffered in silence, hidden away in private chambers or secluded palaces. Even those who survived into adulthood carried the invisible marks of generations of consanguineous unions. The combination of expectation, genetic predisposition, and isolation created a fragile class of rulers whose power was immense, but whose health was often precarious. Across Europe, observers began to speculate about the nature of these dynasties. Outsiders whispered that certain families were cursed, that the very blood which legitimized their rule was also sowing seeds of decay. These rumours, often dismissed as political propaganda, contained an element of truth. The biological costs of maintaining a so-called pure bloodline were real and measurable, even if contemporary science had no language to describe them. Monarchs believed they were following divine law, yet in reality, they were engaging in a risky genetic experiment whose outcome was uncertain and often tragic. By the dawn of the 16th century, it was clear that Europe's ruling families were engaged in a delicate high-stakes game. Every marriage, every alliance was a move on the board of dynastic chess, calculated to extend influence, consolidate power, and maintain the illusion of divine favour. Yet the closer the families became, the more precarious the line of succession grew. Some rulers would thrive despite these constraints, their vigour masking the vulnerabilities hidden within their DNA. Others would falter, their lives and reigns cut short by the silent consequences of generations of repeated consanguinity. And as the century progressed, the stage was being set for a series of tragedies that would illustrate, with devastating clarity, the price of obsessed devotion to the idea of pure blood. Among the earliest Habsburg marriages that drew attention for both their ambition and their consequences was the union of Maximilian I and Mary of Burgundy in 1477. Mary, heiress to the wealthy Burgundian territories, brought immense lands into the Habsburg sphere, securing influence over the Low Countries, parts of modern-day Belgium, and beyond. Maximilian, a shrewd and calculating ruler, understood that marrying Mary was not merely a romantic or political act. It was a cornerstone of dynastic strategy. This single union would reverberate through generations, producing heirs whose bloodlines were more intertwined than the family trees of most European nobles could comprehend. Their descendants would intermarry with other powerful houses across Spain, Portugal and Italy, tightening the web of Habsburg control over Europe. Yet, with each successive cousin marriage, subtle signs of genetic consequence began to appear. Historical accounts suggest that some children suffered from physical ailments, delayed development, or fragile constitutions. Portraits from the era capture these hints in careful brushstrokes: slightly elongated faces, thickened lips, or protruding jaws. The artists, conscious of the court's obsession with perfection, often minimized or stylized these traits. But for those familiar with the lineage, the signs were unmistakable. It was in this environment of meticulous genetic planning that the notion of the Habsburg jaw began to take root, long before Charles II would bring it tragic fame. The physical trait, a protruding lower jaw and misaligned teeth, was not merely cosmetic. In some cases it caused difficulty eating, speaking, or breathing, subtle yet persistent reminders of the cost of repeated consanguinity. Courtiers whispered about it cautiously, while the family maintained a facade of divine favour and perfection. Even today, geneticists studying these early portraits and family records note a striking correlation. Repeated marriages among close relatives increased the likelihood of recessive traits manifesting, and the Habsburgs were the textbook case. Meanwhile, the obsession with maintaining pure blood extended beyond physical health. Marriages were engineered to control temperament, intellect, and personality. Children were trained from birth to embody ideals of piety, grace, and duty, often under intense pressure from tutors, priests, and the court itself. Failure to meet these expectations was not merely a personal failing, it reflected on the sanctity of the lineage. As a result, the Habsburg heirs grew up in an environment where the weight of centuries of calculated unions rested on their shoulders, and where their bodies and minds were both tools and burdens of a far larger dynastic plan. Elsewhere in Europe, dynasties mirrored these practices. The Bourbons, though geographically distant, understood the political necessity of cousin marriages to maintain claims over France, Spain, and their satellite territories. In England, the Tudors and later the Stuarts arranged unions that connected them to continental royalty, sometimes at the cost of producing heirs with vulnerabilities that would not be immediately apparent. Scandinavia, often overlooked in discussions of European inbreeding, also produced its share of closely related unions. Kings and queens sought to reinforce their tenuous claims over small but strategically important territories, often marrying within a restricted pool of eligible nobles. Across all these houses a pattern emerged. Concentrated bloodlines were seen as strength, yet nature quietly exacted its toll. Religion and superstition reinforced these choices. The Church frequently intervened to grant dispensations, allowing marriages that technically fell within prohibited degrees of kinship. Papal authority could be persuaded to bless a union that served the greater good of political stability, creating an environment where spiritual approval and political expediency converged. The very institutions that might have condemned inbreeding became complicit in its perpetuation. Clergy, advisors, and royal councillors all played a role in sustaining a belief system that placed the preservation of blood above the well-being of individual children. It was a world in which divine providence and dynastic ambition intertwined, often to tragic effect. The psychological dimension of these arrangements was equally significant. Children of these marriages were acutely aware, if not always consciously, of the weight they carried. They were symbols as much as individuals, tasked with embodying the perfection of a lineage that spanned continents and centuries. Letters from royal courts hint at the pressure, tutors admonishing children for failing to live up to their heritage, nurses recording fragile health, and siblings growing up with a sense of inescapable duty. For the Habsburgs and other dynasties, the body and the blood became both tools of governance and instruments of expectation, blurring the line between political obligation and personal identity. Even as the early Habsburgs expanded their power and influence, cracks began to show. Chroniclers noted instances of stillbirths, infant mortality, and children who never reached maturity. While contemporaries attributed these occurrences to divine will or environmental factors, modern historians and geneticists recognize the role of inbreeding in these tragedies. The careful orchestration of dynastic alliances, while brilliant in its political calculation, had biological consequences that were unavoidable. Each generation inherited not just titles and lands, but the cumulative effects of centuries of genetic concentration. By the early 16th century, the pattern was clear. European royalty, in its pursuit of purity and divine favour, had created a silent, inexorable experiment. Dynasties amassed power, wealth, and influence, but they were also setting the stage for profound vulnerability. Their obsession with bloodlines was a form of control, an attempt to defy the randomness of nature. Yet, in doing so, they placed themselves in a delicate, high-stakes game with consequences that would unfold over centuries. Success was measured not only in victories or marriages, but in the subtle interplay between heredity and destiny, a balance that was both fragile and relentless. As the 16th century progressed, the concept of divine lineage became more than a convenient justification for power. It evolved into a near religion of its own. Monarchs were depicted not just as political leaders, but as semi-sacred figures whose very blood was thought to carry God's favour. Courts across Europe reinforced this idea through rituals, portraits, and carefully staged public appearances. Every coronation, procession, and marriage ceremony was an opportunity to reinforce the myth that their lineage was immaculate, divinely protected, and destined to endure. Portraiture played a particularly important role in this cultural reinforcement. Painters like Titian, Hans Holbein the Younger, and later Diego Velázquez were commissioned to produce images of royal families that highlighted idealized features, symmetrical faces, and serene expressions. In these works, physical traits that might suggest inherited weaknesses were often minimized, reimagined, or concealed entirely. What emerged was a carefully curated visual narrative. The people in these paintings were almost always flawless, regal, and untouchable, hiding the subtle realities of fragile health, developmental delays, or genetic abnormalities. These images created a public perception of perfection, while at court the realities were far more complex. Within this controlled environment, the pressure on heirs intensified. A prince or princess was expected to embody the ideals of divine perfection, even if their bodies and minds were quietly struggling with the effects of repeated cousin marriages. Tutors, physicians, and clergy all played a role in maintaining the illusion of capability. Children were educated in matters of state, religion, and diplomacy from an early age, but they were also constantly monitored for signs of weakness. Letters and court records from the period reveal a mix of concern and desperation. Families sought remedies for frail health, nervousness, or unusual physical traits, yet any failure to thrive was often interpreted as a challenge to the sanctity of the bloodline. The tension between appearance and reality created a complex psychological environment. Young heirs learned that their value was tied to both their abilities and their ancestry. Any deviation from the ideal, a failure to speak eloquently, a fragile constitution, or even a minor deformity, was a source of anxiety and shame. It was not simply about surviving or ruling, it was about preserving the sanctity of a centuries-long experiment in dynastic concentration. These children were heirs in more than one sense. They inherited the throne, the lands and titles, but they also inherited the cumulative consequences of generations of intermarriage. Meanwhile, the practice of close-kin marriage continued unabated. In many cases, marriages were deliberately arranged between first cousins, uncles and nieces, or even more distant but still closely related relatives. The Habsburgs, in particular, became notorious for this strategy, earning a reputation among contemporary diplomats and chroniclers for their tightly woven family trees. The repeated consanguinity increased the likelihood of recessive traits expressing themselves, a phenomenon that would later become painfully visible in rulers like Charles II of Spain. By this time, the pattern of genetic vulnerability was no longer subtle. It was a quiet, persistent force shaping the destiny of Europe's ruling houses. The consequences of this obsession extended beyond health and appearance. Political and social expectations magnified the stakes of each birth. Every child represented not just continuity of rule, but the legitimacy of the dynasty itself. A weak heir could imperil alliances, provoke internal unrest, and invite foreign intervention. As such, the pressure to marry strategically, maintain purity, and produce healthy offspring was relentless. Monarchs and advisors alike internalized the belief that their survival and the stability of their kingdoms depended on controlling the most intimate aspects of family life: blood, marriage, and reproduction. Yet, even with the careful orchestration of marriages and the constant reinforcement of divine legitimacy, the dynasties could not escape the natural laws of heredity. Medical records, personal letters, and chronicles from the era reveal a pattern. Illnesses, miscarriages, and physical anomalies appeared with troubling frequency among children of closely related unions. While these outcomes were often attributed to fate, astrology, or spiritual imbalance, the underlying cause was increasingly apparent to modern historians. Generations of intermarriage had concentrated both power and vulnerability. For the families themselves, however, the notion of divine blood remained an unshakable belief, a lens through which every misfortune could be interpreted as a test or a lesson from God, rather than a consequence of human choice. By the close of the 16th century, Europe's aristocratic landscape had become a tapestry of interlocking bloodlines. The Habsburgs, Bourbons, Tudors, and numerous smaller houses had created a continent-spanning web of alliances that ensured both dominance and vulnerability. Political gain and biological risk became inseparable, each generation inheriting not only lands and titles, but also the compounded consequences of centuries of carefully curated unions. Monarchs were both architects and subjects of this experiment, their destinies intertwined with the silent, invisible laws of heredity. The stage was now set for the tragedies that would define the coming centuries. As dynasties expanded their influence, the delicate balance between divine ambition and biological reality grew ever more precarious. Success brought wealth, power, and global influence, yet it also amplified the consequences of missteps in the genetic design of the family. In many ways, Europe's most powerful houses had constructed their own invisible labyrinth, a network of blood and duty from which escape was impossible, even for the most brilliant or fortunate heirs. In this world, the line between myth and reality blurred. Portraits suggested perfection, while letters hinted at frailty. Ceremonies proclaimed divine favour, even as children struggled under the weight of their inheritance. The illusion of purity became a doctrine, a way of seeing the world that allowed rulers to ignore the very natural forces quietly shaping their fates. And for those who would come after, the consequences of these centuries of calculated marriages would be unavoidable, ultimately revealing that even the most revered dynasties could not escape the immutable laws of nature. By the dawn of the 17th century, the consequences of centuries-long dynastic planning were visible not just in individual heirs, but across the European political landscape. The Habsburgs had achieved unprecedented influence, their branches entwined across Austria, Spain, the Low Countries and Italy. The Bourbons controlled France and increasingly intertwined with Spanish lines. Even the smaller Scandinavian and Italian houses were interlaced through carefully orchestrated unions. The web was so tightly knit that Europe's rulers were, in many cases, closer relatives than allies. Diplomats and chroniclers often remarked upon the strange symmetry of these families, a symmetry that masked both brilliance and fragility. The obsession with pure blood had created a paradox. The more power these families amassed, the more vulnerable they became to the hidden costs of inbreeding. Infertility, deformity, and chronic illness were quietly accumulating, like cracks forming in the foundations of a grand palace. Historical records show that some marriages produced children who could not survive infancy, while others brought forth heirs whose physical or mental health was compromised in subtle but significant ways. These issues, while often minimized in courtly reports, had real consequences for the stability of thrones and the continuity of dynasties. Consider, for instance, the case of Philip II of Spain, a Habsburg whose reign extended across Europe, the Americas, and beyond. Philip was a product of generations of carefully orchestrated marriages, yet his own life bore subtle reminders of the costs of such concentrated bloodlines. While he was politically shrewd and militarily ambitious, contemporaries noted that his health was delicate and that he was prone to bouts of severe illness. His marriages, though designed to reinforce political alliances, would eventually produce heirs whose own capacities were shaped not only by upbringing and education, but by the centuries of consanguinity that preceded them. Elsewhere, France's Bourbons faced similar dilemmas. Their obsession with marrying within close family lines created an intricate lattice of relations that ensured political dominance, but heightened the likelihood of inherited vulnerabilities. Kings and queens became symbols of both divine perfection and human fragility, their courtly appearances hiding the quiet consequences of their ancestors' marital strategies. Medical observers, tutors, and chroniclers all noted these tensions, yet few dared to challenge the prevailing orthodoxy. The doctrine of divine blood was too entrenched. To question it would be to question the legitimacy of kings themselves. The psychological ramifications of this obsession extended far beyond the individual heirs. Entire courts operated under the shadow of expectation, uncertainty, and surveillance. Every child was observed not only for aptitude and temperament, but for the subtler signs of hereditary weakness. Heirs were scrutinized for signs of mental or physical frailty, and any irregularity could influence political calculations, alliances, and succession plans. The entire system depended on the delicate balance of maintaining appearances while managing the hidden realities of concentrated ancestry. What emerges from this early period in European history is a striking lesson about the interplay of ambition, faith, and biology. Monarchs sought to harness the power of their lineage as if it were an inexhaustible resource, yet in doing so they subjected themselves to vulnerabilities that were invisible, relentless, and ultimately unavoidable. The drive to maintain purity was at once a testament to human ingenuity and a cautionary tale of hubris. These dynasties were architects of empires, yet they were also prisoners of their own bloodlines, bound by the imperatives of strategy and the illusion of divine favour. And so, the first chapter of this story closes with a haunting question. What is the true cost of obsession with blood and lineage? For the Habsburgs, Bourbons, and their contemporaries, the answer would not be immediate. It would unfold slowly, generation by generation, culminating in heirs whose lives embodied the ultimate intersection of power, expectation, and genetic consequence. The stage was set for a Europe dominated by interwoven dynasties, each striving for perfection while unknowingly courting tragedy. The myth of pure blood had become both a tool and a trap, a doctrine that would shape the destiny of empires for centuries to come. The courtly portraits, the sprawling palaces, and the meticulously documented marriages are all remnants of this obsession, tangible reminders of a world in which ambition and biology collided. Behind the glittering pageantry and ceremonial grandeur lay a quieter story, one that was just beginning to reveal itself. The seeds of future tragedy had already been sown in the intricate patterns of blood, and soon, as history would demonstrate, even kings could not escape the consequences of their ancestors' choices. In reflecting on this early period, it becomes clear that European monarchs were engaged in an experiment that was both political and biological. They manipulated alliances, engineered marriages, and reinforced the sanctity of blood with ritual, propaganda, and superstition. Yet for all their planning, the invisible hand of heredity operated independently of ambition. Nature, indifferent to crowns or crowns' illusions, had its own calculations. The results would be felt most acutely in the centuries to come, when some of the most famous and tragic figures of European history would bear the marks of these carefully orchestrated unions, illustrating the enduring tension between power, perception, and the relentless forces of inheritance. And with that, the curtain falls on the origins of Europe's obsession with pure blood. The dynasties had laid their foundations, set their rules, and begun weaving a web of alliances and heredity that would reach across the continent. The Habsburgs, the Bourbons, the Tudors, and many others had ensured that Europe's history would be shaped not only by war and diplomacy, but by the unseen, intimate power of blood. What follows in the coming chapters are the consequences of these choices, the triumphs, the tragedies, and the haunting legacy of dynastic obsession that would define centuries of European history. Imagine Europe in the late Middle Ages, a continent stitched together not by treaties or armies, but by marriages. Every kingdom, duchy, and principality had its own calculation for power, and nothing, absolutely nothing, mattered more than bloodlines. A royal wedding wasn't just a family celebration, it was a political weapon, a territorial chess move, and sometimes a gamble with history itself. Take Spain, for example. Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile weren't just star-crossed lovers in a storybook sense. Their marriage in 1469 didn't just unite two hearts, it united two powerful kingdoms, setting the stage for Spain's emergence as a European superpower. But behind the pomp and ceremony, every arrangement in the royal courts had a strategy. Who you married could make or break your kingdom, decide the fate of your children, and in some cases shape the future of entire continents. Across Europe the rules were simple. Marry someone powerful, preferably someone who wouldn't bring dishonour or dilute your lineage. Sometimes this meant marrying a distant cousin. Sometimes it meant forming alliances with foreign houses hundreds of miles away. Dynasties like the Habsburgs took this philosophy to its extreme. Marriages weren't personal, they were negotiations, signed, sealed, and often enforced by armies standing by. And it wasn't just about keeping your lands safe. Marriages were a way to claim new territories, secure peace, or even inherit thrones. One union could give a kingdom access to ports, wealth, or critical trade routes. The game was as much about economics and logistics as it was about family. That's why dynastic marriage strategies often required incredible foresight. advisors, diplomats, and matchmakers poured over family trees like generals planning campaigns. Every cousin, niece, and distant relative became a potential player in a vast political game. But here's the thing, what makes this period so fascinating and a little terrifying is how personal it all was. These alliances weren't just signed on parchment, they were lived by the people involved. Imagine being a 14-year-old princess, whisked from your home to a strange kingdom, expected to marry someone you've never met, and instantly become a linchpin of European power. Your daily life was a chessboard, and your heart, health, and even happiness were secondary to the goals of your house. France, for instance, provides some of the most dramatic examples. In the 16th century, Catherine de' Medici was married into the French royal family as a child. She grew up knowing that every move she made, every word she spoke, was part of a broader strategy. Sometimes to secure alliances, sometimes to protect her children, and sometimes to manipulate the very kings and nobles who surrounded her. Marriage in these circles was a tool of diplomacy, espionage, and survival, all rolled into one. And then there's the way the Habsburgs elevated this strategy into a kind of obsession. Austria's rulers literally turned marriage into a systematic program. They didn't just arrange alliances, they engineered them across generations. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces. Every branch of the family was carefully monitored, not just for political alignment, but for the traits it would pass on to future heirs. By the time you got to the 16th and 17th centuries, the Habsburgs had created a dynastic network that spanned most of Europe. They weren't just kings and queens, they were conductors of a continent-wide orchestra of power, each note a marriage, each chord a lineage. But here's the twist that makes this history so compelling. While dynasties were obsessively planning, nature had its own ideas. All these repeated unions between close relatives began to accumulate consequences, genetic weaknesses, deformities, and vulnerabilities that nobody at the time fully understood. The very strategy designed to secure power also introduced fragility into the bloodline. It's almost poetic. The more these families concentrated their influence, the more precarious their survival became. The chessboard was vast, but the players were human, and humans carry consequences in their DNA. Let's zoom into England for a moment. The Tudors were masters of strategic marriages, but unlike the Habsburgs, they had fewer opportunities for repeated inbreeding, which in some ways protected them. Henry VIII's children were married strategically across Europe, aiming to cement alliances with Spain, France, and the Holy Roman Empire. Yet even with careful planning, political and personal ambitions clashed. Marriages created friction between nations, court intrigue, and even rebellion. Strategy alone couldn't control human ambition, emotion, or the consequences of genetics. Now, imagine the tension inside these courts. Every banquet, ceremony, and public appearance was layered with meaning. Who sat next to whom at a dinner table wasn't just etiquette, it was a signal. Who got married this year, or who was denied a union, sent ripples across continents, and the stakes, total control of wealth, land, and influence. One misstep could topple kingdoms. One child born wrong could end alliances or provoke succession crises. In other words, marriages were simultaneously human stories and historical earthquakes. But despite the risks and pressures, dynasties rarely deviated from their strategies. They didn't allow love to dictate politics. Personal desire was secondary, sometimes even punished. Marriages were carefully orchestrated to maintain or expand power. Hearts were considered irrelevant. Bloodlines were everything. And while modern audiences might recoil at the cold calculation, to these families it was survival. Political survival, personal survival, and ultimately survival of the dynasty. By the end of the 16th century, Europe had transformed into a continent where strategy ruled marriage, and marriage ruled the fate of nations. Royal families were deeply entangled, alliances overlapped, and dynasties like the Habsburgs had perfected a system that was both brilliant and terrifying. Power, influence, and survival all depended on navigating the intricate web of familial relationships, a web that could crumble if a single link weakened, whether from illness, misfortune, or the silent consequences of inbreeding. And that's where the story gets really gripping. Because while these families were planning and plotting, living out their lives in gilded palaces, their carefully engineered networks were quietly setting the stage for some of the most dramatic rises and falls in European history. Wars, successions, betrayals, all intertwined with the simple yet profoundly consequential act of choosing a spouse. Now let's zoom in on one of the most fascinating and infamous examples of strategic marriage, the Habsburgs. By the 16th century, they weren't just marrying to consolidate power. They were essentially building a pan-European dynasty with science, or at least the pretense of it, guiding every union. Cousins married cousins, nephews married nieces. Territories weren't the only thing being merged, genes were too. And while this strategy allowed them to expand influence across Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, and even parts of Italy, it also created the perfect storm for long-term consequences. Take Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. His empire stretched across Europe, North Africa, and the Americas. That's right, one man, ruling more land than any of his predecessors could imagine, largely because of carefully orchestrated marriages that connected him to almost every major European royal family. But here's the catch. While politically brilliant, Charles was the product of generations of these concentrated bloodlines. His own health was often fragile, and while he was intellectually capable and ambitious, the risks of such close intermarriage were quietly accumulating in the dynasty. Meanwhile, back in France, Catherine de' Medici was playing a similarly high-stakes game. Married into the French royal family at a young age, she quickly became a central player in European politics. Her children's marriages were meticulously planned to maintain influence and protect the French crown, yet the pressure on these young royals was immense. Imagine being a teenager, constantly reminded that your marriage could secure peace or spark war, that your behaviour could influence the rise or fall of your house. It's like living inside a game of chess where every move you make is watched, analysed and critiqued, and the stakes are literally the survival of nations. And then there's Spain again. The Habsburgs there perfected the art of the calculated union. Philip II of Spain, son of Charles V, married his cousins, further tightening the family network. These marriages were carefully crafted to maintain territorial control, prevent outside influence, and consolidate wealth. But as we've already hinted, the consequences of this tight-knit genetic network were becoming apparent. Subtle deformities, frail health, and an increased risk of inherited diseases were quietly creeping into the lineage. To the public, and even to most courtiers, everything seemed perfect. The portraits, the ceremonies, the pageantry, all suggested flawless divine rulers. But behind closed doors, the reality was far more precarious. The thing about strategic marriages in this era is that they weren't just about power. They were also about optics, perception, and symbolism. Every union sent a message. This house is strong, this bloodline is pure, this dynasty is destined to endure. And that message mattered because the perception of power was almost as important as power itself. If a rival kingdom sensed weakness, even the faintest suggestion of it, they could exploit it. Wars, rebellions, assassinations, all could be triggered by a miscalculated marriage or a poorly timed union. Let's step back for a second and think about the human element. These strategic marriages were often arranged when the parties were children, sometimes as young as 7 or 8. Can you imagine being plucked from your family home and told, you're going to marry this person, and your life, their life, and the fate of your kingdom depends on it? Love, personal desire, and freedom were luxuries royalty couldn't afford. Every kiss, every handshake, every interaction was carefully scrutinised, and even a minor misstep could have monumental consequences. In some ways, these young royals were living the ultimate high-stakes reality show, but with real lives and real deaths on the line. And while we're talking consequences, it's impossible not to mention the long-term genetic effects that many of these dynasties faced. The repeated intermarriages that were designed to keep bloodlines pure ended up concentrating hereditary issues. While contemporaries didn't have the science to explain it, historians today can trace patterns of deformities, chronic illnesses, and even mental health struggles in families like the Habsburgs and Bourbons. The very tool that gave them power, their blood, also introduced vulnerabilities that, over generations, could destabilise kingdoms. The Bourbons in France faced similar dilemmas. They arranged marriages to secure claims in Spain and Italy, carefully plotting out alliances that would expand influence without risking the line. But no matter how meticulously they planned, they couldn't entirely escape the human element. Ambition, jealousy, illness, or even simple misfortune could disrupt the best-laid plans. Strategy could guide marriage, but it couldn't control nature, human emotion, or the unpredictable chaos of politics. And that's what makes this period in European history so fascinating. It's not just about kings and queens, crowns, or palaces. It's about human beings trying to manipulate their world through marriage, trying to control power, perception, and even their own biology. Every union was a gamble. Every child born was a potential pawn, heir, or liability. And across Europe, the consequences of these strategic marriages would ripple for centuries, shaping wars, shaping borders, and shaping the very genetic legacy of some of history's most famous dynasties. By the end of the 16th century, you start to see the web of alliances fully taking shape. Europe's royal families weren't just neighbouring houses, they were deeply interwoven, like threads in a massive tapestry. Pull one string, and the whole fabric trembled. And all of this began with something deceptively simple: a marriage, a contract, a union designed not for love, but for survival and power. Now, let's talk about what happens when these carefully crafted strategies don't go according to plan. Because in a world where marriage is power and power is survival, one misstep can ignite chaos. And history is packed with examples of unions that promised stability but delivered scandal, betrayal, or even war. Take the case of Mary, Queen of Scots. Born in 1542, Mary was a pawn in the intricate game of European dynasties almost from the moment she took her first breath. She was betrothed as a child to the French Dauphin, a move designed to secure French support for Scotland and counterbalance English influence. At first glance, it was a perfect strategy, politically brilliant. But as she grew older, her personal desires and circumstances clashed violently with the rigid expectations of dynastic politics. Her marriages would eventually embroil Scotland and England in political turmoil, with consequences that reverberated across Europe. Here, the human cost of strategic unions becomes painfully clear. Even the most carefully arranged marriage can't account for ambition, passion, or political tension. Meanwhile, the Habsburgs were quietly stacking marriages like dominoes. Charles II of Spain, often remembered as one of the most tragic outcomes of repeated inbreeding, was a living example of the hidden costs of strategy. By the time he was born in 1661, the Habsburg family tree was a tightly wound network of cousins, uncles, and nieces. The result? Charles suffered from severe physical and mental disabilities. Despite this, every marriage in the family continued to be arranged with the same single-minded purpose: maintain territory, consolidate power, and reinforce the illusion of divine blood. The dynasty's obsession with strategy had created an empire, but one riddled with vulnerabilities that no diplomacy or military might could fix. France's royal marriages tell a parallel story. Catherine de' Medici, who had orchestrated her children's unions with calculated precision, found herself navigating the fallout when those marriages failed to produce the desired outcomes. Her daughter, Elizabeth of Valois, was married off to Philip II of Spain to cement peace between France and Spain. But politics is rarely so neat. Cultural differences, personal tragedies, and the unpredictable nature of succession created tensions that no marriage contract could resolve. These unions were supposed to be straightforward tools of diplomacy, but the human element, temperament, health, and ambition always complicated matters. And then there's England. Henry VIII's relentless pursuit of a male heir demonstrates the extremes of strategic marriage. His unions with Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, and others were driven by dynastic calculation, political necessity, and religious authority. But each marriage carried consequences: political upheaval, religious reformation, and personal tragedy. Even a king with the power of England at his fingertips could not fully control the outcomes of his marital strategies. This shows a simple truth. No matter how brilliant the planning, human unpredictability always plays a role. The stakes of marriage strategy also extended to diplomacy and war. When dynastic unions failed or produced weak heirs, the resulting vacuum could invite external threats. Entire kingdoms could become unstable, leaving borders vulnerable to invasion. A miscalculated marriage could lead to succession crises as rival claimants challenged the throne. These were not theoretical risks, they happened repeatedly. Europe's history of conflict is deeply intertwined with these dynastic strategies. Wars were often fought over the consequences of a single marriage, a single child, or a single perceived weakness in a royal line. But here's what makes it really cinematic. Even in these high-stakes games, people were still human. Imagine a young princess sent to a foreign court to marry a man she barely knows, navigating palace intrigue, political spies, and her own fears, all while knowing that the fate of nations rests on her shoulders. Or a king, pressured to marry for power rather than love, struggling with illness, temperament, or inherited vulnerabilities that no doctor or advisor can fix. These stories are not just political lessons, they are human dramas played out on the grandest possible stage. And let's not forget the subtle psychological consequences. Generations of arranged marriages, constant scrutiny, and the pressure to produce heirs created intense stress for royal families. Children were often educated and trained to embody the perfect combination of intelligence, piety, and diplomacy, while also expected to carry the genetic legacy of their ancestors flawlessly. Failure, weakness, or illness was not just personal, it was political. And in such a high-pressure environment, it's no wonder that mental health issues, nervous breakdowns, and unusual behaviours were common, even if rarely recorded openly. So, by the mid-17th century, Europe's royal families had become masters of a double-edged game. Marriage could secure power, expand influence, and preserve dynasties, but it could also concentrate vulnerabilities, create personal tragedies, and destabilize entire kingdoms. The strategy of arranging unions to secure dominance came with invisible costs: frail heirs, political tension, and the ever-present shadow of human unpredictability. It's a story of brilliance and obsession, of calculated moves and unforeseen consequences, and of families whose ambition often outpaced theirs to control the outcomes of their own bloodlines. In essence, marriage in this era was a high-stakes balancing act. Every union was a calculated risk, and yet, no matter how well planned, the unpredictable elements of biology, temperament, and politics could unravel even the most meticulously constructed strategy. From the Habsburgs to the Bourbons, from Scotland to England, the narrative is the same. Dynastic ambition shaped Europe, but it also sowed the seeds of fragility, tragedy, and ultimately history itself. Let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. By the 17th century, dynastic marriage wasn't just a tool, it had become an empire-building machine. Entire continents were effectively mapped out by unions, dowries, and contracts. Spain, Austria, France, and England weren't simply kingdoms. They were networks of intermarried families whose influence sprawled across Europe and into the New World. Every marriage was a calculated investment, a multi-generational strategy designed to maximize power, wealth, and territorial control. The Habsburgs once again were masters of this game. Their motto could have been, "If you can't conquer with swords, conquer with a wedding." And they did. By carefully arranging marriages over decades, they linked themselves to almost every major European house: Portugal, Bohemia, Hungary, Naples, the Low Countries, you name it. The Habsburgs had a marital claim there. Each union added a new layer of influence, but it also added another layer of complexity and risk. Managing such a sprawling network of family alliances required diplomacy, vigilance, and sometimes ruthless decision-making. Take the Spanish Habsburgs as an example. Philip II's marriage to his niece, Anna of Austria, was designed to consolidate Spanish and Austrian claims. The union reinforced dynastic cohesion, but it also exemplified the extreme end of consanguinity. The closer the bloodlines, the higher the risk of inherited vulnerabilities. Charles II, born from these calculated unions, would later epitomise the tragic consequences of this strategy. His health was frail, his mental faculties limited, and his life became a cautionary tale of how dynastic ambition can spiral out of control when human biology is ignored. Meanwhile, in France, the Bourbons were perfecting their own network of alliances. Louis XIII and Louis XIV married strategically to secure peace and strengthen claims across Europe. Their children's marriages were designed not just to consolidate power at home, but to create influence abroad, ensuring France could compete with the Habsburgs' sprawling web. In both Spain and France, the message was clear. A royal marriage wasn't just a personal union. It was a geopolitical maneuver with consequences that could last centuries. But here's the human side of all this strategy. Behind every calculated union were individuals, children, teenagers, young adults, whose lives were completely dictated by dynastic politics. Love, personal happiness, and autonomy were luxuries they couldn't afford. Imagine being raised to think of your body and your blood as instruments of empire. Every choice, every move, every pregnancy was scrutinized not just for personal outcome, but for the survival and expansion of the dynasty. And failure could be devastating, both personally and politically. Miscarriages, stillbirths, or weak heirs weren't just tragedies. They were threats to power and stability. Now let's talk about how these marriage networks shaped Europe in a tangible way. When a Habsburg married a Bourbon, or a Spanish princess wed an Austrian archduke, borders shifted without a single sword being drawn. Treaties were embedded in bloodlines. Alliances were secured through bedrooms, not battlefields. Wars could be avoided or triggered by the success or failure of a single union, and yet this enormous power came with fragility built into its very DNA. The more concentrated the families became, the higher the stakes for every future generation. One miscalculated marriage could weaken a kingdom for decades. It's fascinating to think about how perception played into this as well. Portraits, court ceremonies, and public appearances all reinforced the image of perfection and divine right. The world saw flawless monarchs in elegant gowns or armour, sitting proudly on thrones. But behind closed doors, many of these heirs were struggling with health issues, frailty, or developmental challenges resulting from generations of carefully curated but overly concentrated unions. Dynasties were projecting invincibility, even as their human bodies silently betrayed the long-term consequences of strategic ambition. And yet, the strategy persisted. Why? Because the potential rewards were enormous. If a family could control multiple territories through marriage, they didn't just gain land, they gained influence, wealth, and the ability to shape European history. The risk, as history shows, was worth it in the eyes of these dynasties. They were playing a game of empire on a grand scale, betting that calculated alliances would outweigh the human and biological costs. And for centuries, in many cases, it worked. By the end of the 17th century, Europe's royal houses had transformed into something almost unrecognisable from their medieval origins. They were not just rulers, they were strategists, engineers, and sometimes even gamblers, carefully plotting each marriage, each alliance, each generation with military precision. They created a world where love and personal choice were irrelevant, and survival, influence, and bloodline purity were everything. And yet, beneath this calculated surface, the human element remained. Children still cried, princes still rebelled, queens still loved and lost. Nature, stubborn as ever, reminded them that no amount of strategy could fully control heredity or the unpredictability of human behaviour. The dynasty's success was breathtaking, but their fragility was equally extraordinary. One generation could solidify power, and the next could unravel it. The interplay between ambition, marriage, and biology was, quite literally, the story of Europe itself. As we close this section, you can start to see the duality. These royal families were architects of power, creating networks that shaped continents, yet they were also prisoners of the very strategies they devised. Marriage was their weapon, their shield, and their gamble. And as we move into the next section, we'll explore the consequences of these unions more deeply. The personal tragedies, the political crises, and the moments where dynastic ambition collided with the relentless laws of nature in ways that would leave permanent marks on European history. Across Europe, certain marriages became legendary, not just for the alliances they created, but for the drama, scandal, and tragedy that followed. Take the infamous union of Maria Theresa of Spain and Louis XIV of France. It was meant to cement peace between two powerful kingdoms, a carefully orchestrated move to stabilise Europe after decades of conflict. The reality, however, was far messier. Cultural differences, court rivalries, and the high expectations placed upon them as symbols of dynastic perfection created tensions that neither marriage contract nor diplomatic negotiation could resolve. Their story reminds us that even the most calculated unions could be vulnerable to human emotion and circumstance. In the Habsburg courts, history seems almost scripted for tragedy. Charles II of Spain stands as the ultimate symbol of the consequences of over-engineered bloodlines. He was the product of generations of closely related unions, and the effects were devastating. Physically frail, mentally limited, and plagued by health issues, Charles embodied the unintended consequences of dynastic obsession. Every advisor, physician, and family member understood the stakes, yet the dynasty continued to prioritise political gain over genetic diversity. Charles's life was a cautionary tale writ large. The more tightly a family's power was interwoven, the more fragile its foundation became. England, too, offers cautionary tales that read like high-stakes dramas. Henry VIII's relentless pursuit of a male heir reshaped the kingdom, ignited religious upheaval, and set his family on a path filled with betrayal, executions, and political tension. Each marriage was intended as a strategic move, a way to secure the Tudor line and strengthen England's position in Europe. Yet the outcomes were unpredictable. Some marriages failed to produce heirs, others produced heirs whose legitimacy was questioned, and the human cost was enormous. This period illustrates an enduring truth. Even kings could not fully control the complex interplay of politics, genetics, and personal desire. These examples underscore a broader point. Dynastic marriages were a gamble with extraordinarily high stakes. One union could stabilise a kingdom. One misstep could trigger wars, revolts, or succession crises. In some cases, these marriages determined the very map of Europe, shaping borders, alliances, and conflicts for generations. The strategy was sophisticated, almost Machiavellian, yet always subject to human and natural forces beyond anyone's control. A particularly striking example of unintended consequences can be seen in the Scandinavian courts. While often overlooked in discussions of European inbreeding, royal families in Denmark, Sweden, and Norway engaged in strategic unions to maintain claims and consolidate power. These marriages reinforced alliances within the region, but also concentrated hereditary vulnerabilities. In subtle ways, These smaller dynasties mirrored the patterns of the Habsburgs and Bourbons. Ambition and strategy intersected with biology, producing results that were both brilliant and precarious. The psychological toll of these arrangements cannot be overstated. Children and young heirs were trained from birth to embody the ideals of their house. They learned languages, military strategy, diplomacy, and courtly etiquette, all under the watchful eye of tutors and advisors. But they were also acutely aware that their value was tied not only to their skills and intellect but to their blood. Any deviation from the expected norms, physical frailty, illness, or even emotional instability, was interpreted as a potential threat to the dynasty. In this way, strategic marriages shaped not only politics and borders, but the inner lives and identities of the people who lived them. By the late 17th century, the consequences of centuries of calculated unions were impossible to ignore. Weak heirs, health complications, and even psychological fragility began to shape the fates of entire kingdoms. The intricate web of dynastic marriages had created both power and vulnerability in equal measure. Families like the Habsburgs had expanded influence to unprecedented levels, yet each new generation inherited not only titles and territories, but also the cumulative consequences of intermarriage. Political calculation and human biology had collided in ways that were as dramatic as any battle or treaty. Looking back, it becomes clear that European history during this period was as much about bloodlines as it was about armies. Wars were fought not only over land or resources, but to enforce or challenge dynastic claims. Alliances, treaties, and successions often hinged on the results of a single marriage. Every royal family was engaged in a complex multi-generational game where power, perception, and heredity were intertwined. To succeed, monarchs had to be not only shrewd politicians, but also meticulous managers of human biology, orchestrating unions with foresight and precision that rivaled any military campaign. Yet despite all the planning, the human element remained uncontrollable. Emotions, ambition, illness, and the randomness of inheritance continually tested the best-laid strategies. Dynasties could plan for generations, but they could not predict everything, and the consequences were often profound. The history of strategic marriages is therefore a story of both brilliance and hubris, an extraordinary testament to human ingenuity, but also a cautionary tale about the limits of control. The picture is clear. Marriage in early modern Europe was far more than a personal union. It was a strategic instrument, a political calculation, and a gamble with enormous stakes. Dynasties expanded influence, shaped borders, and engineered bloodlines, yet they also sowed the seeds of fragility, conflict, and human tragedy. Every wedding, every union, carried the weight of continents and the consequences of generations. Europe's royal families had spent centuries perfecting the art of strategy. Marriages arranged, alliances forged, bloodlines concentrated. But as history often reminds us, perfection is rarely permanent. When ambition meets biology, and human emotion meets political necessity, tragedy is almost inevitable. In this chapter, we're diving into some of the most infamous examples where dynastic planning collided head-on with reality, and the results were as heartbreaking as they were historically significant. Let's start with the Habsburgs, because if there's a dynasty that embodies both brilliance and biological consequence, it's them. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the Habsburg family tree was like a densely woven tapestry, every branch touching another, every thread deliberately intertwined. But with all that closeness came consequences. Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg ruler of the Spanish line, became the tragic culmination of generations of intermarriage. He was physically frail, suffered severe disabilities, and his mental faculties were limited. Historians often describe him as a living example of how dynastic obsession can spiral into disaster. His life was a warning written in blood, illustrating that even the most meticulous strategy cannot override the relentless rules of heredity. Meanwhile, the Bourbon line in France was weaving its own tapestry of tragedy. Consider Louis XIV's family. The Sun King's marriages and the arranged unions of his children were intended to cement French power, strengthen alliances, and secure the throne for generations. But the human cost was staggering. Children who survived infancy were often sickly, and many did not live to adulthood. Behind the opulent palaces and glittering courts, there was a quiet, persistent toll: anxiety, illness, and the constant pressure to embody the ideal of a perfect heir. These dynastic tragedies were not just personal, they were political, shaping the stability of entire nations. The Tudors of England also offer a dramatic lens into the darker side of dynastic ambition. Henry VIII's relentless pursuit of a male heir reshaped the kingdom politically, religiously and socially, but it came at immense personal cost. His children, particularly Edward VI, experienced intense pressure from birth, burdened with expectations that were as heavy as any crown. Edward was sickly and fragile, Elizabeth faced constant threats to her legitimacy, and Mary's reign was marred by political instability. Each royal child became a symbol, a vessel for the ambitions of a dynasty, yet also a tragic reminder of the human vulnerability hidden beneath the gilded surface of power. One of the most cinematic and heartbreaking tragedies involves the Austrian Habsburgs in the 17th century. The archdukes and archduchesses were expected to marry strategically, often within the family, to maintain influence across Europe. But these repeated unions intensified genetic risks. Infertility, physical deformities, and chronic illnesses became increasingly common, quietly eroding the foundations of dynastic power. For the outside world, these families remained symbols of perfection and divinely ordained authority. Inside their palaces, however, the reality was starkly different. Fragile bodies, fragile minds, and the constant anxiety of succession looming over every child. The psychological weight on these young royals cannot be overstated. Imagine being taught from birth that your entire value, your worth, your legacy, your very survival is tied to your ability to produce heirs and maintain the family line. Every misstep, every illness, every failure could be seen as a threat to the dynasty itself. Portraits and court ceremonies celebrated perfection, yet they masked the immense pressures, the disappointments, and the grief quietly endured behind palace walls. It's easy to romanticize the grandeur of European courts, but the personal stories tell a far darker, more human tale. Even outside of direct inheritance, the consequences of concentrated dynastic bloodlines were devastating. The Habsburg jaw, a term you might have heard in passing, wasn't just a physical quirk. It was a visible marker of generations of intermarriage. Over time, these subtle traits accumulated, and the combination of physical and mental fragility began to influence the fate of entire kingdoms. Wars, political instability, and succession crises were often exacerbated by heirs who were unwell, childless, or unable to rule effectively. The very strategy designed to preserve power sometimes threatened to unravel it completely. Yet despite these tragedies, European monarchs continued to marry strategically, obsessively, and sometimes recklessly. The promise of political gain was too great, the perception of divine blood too seductive. Each generation was a gamble, a calculated risk where the stakes were both personal and continental. These families were simultaneously architects and prisoners of their own design, masters of strategy on one hand, and tragically vulnerable on the other. By the end of this section, it's clear that dynastic tragedies weren't just the result of bad luck or poor parenting. They were structural, baked into the very strategy that had made these families so powerful. Politics, ambition, and the relentless pursuit of influence created conditions where human biology and personal vulnerability collided with historical destiny. The stories of Charles II, the Bourbons, the Tudors, and countless others are stark reminders that power and perfection often come at an unbearable cost. As we peel back the layers of Europe's royal families, the tragedies become almost cinematic, stories that feel like they belong in a drama series rather than history books. Take the Habsburgs again. Charles II of Spain, often called the Bewitched, was perhaps the most infamous example of dynastic consequences. Every generation before him had been carefully engineered to preserve power and influence. Yet the cumulative effect of repeated close family marriages left Charles frail, sickly, and intellectually limited. He became king at just 4 years old, and the Spanish court, which should have been a seat of strength, was instead a stage for political manoeuvring around his weaknesses. Powerful ministers and advisers were constantly plotting, knowing that any misstep could alter the balance of European power. Meanwhile, the Bourbons in France were grappling with their own web of dynastic pressure. Louis XIV, the Sun King, had children who were expected to continue the legacy of French power, yet not all survived the relentless demands of court life. Some of his heirs suffered illnesses that, while not fully understood at the time, were likely exacerbated by inbreeding and the immense pressure placed on them from birth. These personal tragedies were inseparable from political consequences. Succession crises, territorial disputes, and diplomatic tensions were all fueled by the fragility of the human body and mind. In England, the Tudor line was a drama of ambition and tragedy. Edward VI ascended the throne as a child, sickly and frail, with a kingdom that relied on his survival. Mary I and Elizabeth I followed, each facing the intense scrutiny and political pressure that comes with being the linchpin of a dynasty. Mary's reign, marked by religious upheaval, also carried the weight of personal and dynastic expectation. Elizabeth, known as the Virgin Queen, famously refused to marry, perhaps understanding the immense personal and political cost of dynastic unions. Even as she manoeuvred through politics with brilliance, the ghosts of her family's past marriages haunted the decisions of her reign. Some dynasties, particularly in Austria, experienced more subtle tragedies. Archdukes and archduchesses were often married within the family, and over time, the results manifested in ways both visible and hidden. Physical deformities, chronic illnesses, and even mental instability became more common. Portraits painted for public appearances often concealed these realities, presenting heirs as flawless embodiments of divine right. Behind closed doors, however, these young royals grappled with physical limitations and social expectations that were impossible to escape. The contrast between appearance and reality in these families is a reminder that dynastic power often comes with profound hidden costs. One striking example involves Maria Anna of Spain, who married her uncle Ferdinand III of Austria. This union was politically advantageous, reinforcing the Habsburg presence across Europe, but it also exemplifies the extremes of consanguinity that had become normalized in these families. Children born from such unions carried increased genetic risks, contributing to a cycle of frailty and vulnerability. The empire may have appeared strong from the outside, but the human cost was silently accumulating, a ticking time bomb within the family tree. Beyond the physical and intellectual consequences, the emotional weight on these royals was immense. They were often isolated, expected to be paragons of virtue and intelligence, while facing the constant scrutiny of court, family, and the public. Many were painfully aware that their failures could jeopardize the dynasty's future. Marriages that seemed like political victories often came with personal heartbreaks, and the individuals involved had little choice in the matter. Love, freedom, and self-determination were luxuries that royalty could rarely afford. The ripple effects of these tragedies extended far beyond palace walls. Wars, succession disputes, and international tensions were all influenced by the fragility of heirs. When an heir was sickly or incapable, neighbouring kingdoms saw opportunity. Alliances could shift, treaties could unravel, and centuries of strategic planning could be undone. The personal and political were inseparably intertwined, and Europe's history is filled with moments where the health and capabilities of a single royal child dictated the fate of nations. Even seemingly minor genetic weaknesses could have catastrophic consequences. The Habsburg jaw, a physical trait passed down through generations, became a symbol of both dynastic pride and hidden vulnerability. It represented the meticulous planning of marriages, but also the unintended consequences of concentrating bloodlines. These subtle traits, combined with fragile health and political pressure, created a perfect storm where personal tragedy could cascade into historical upheaval. By mid-17th century, the pattern was undeniable. Dynastic strategy had created both power and fragility. Families like the Habsburgs, Bourbons, and Tudors had engineered influence across continents, but each generation inherited not only wealth and territory, but the risks embedded in centuries of careful, often obsessive planning. The human cost was staggering. Frailty, early deaths, and psychological burdens that shaped not only individual lives, but the course of European history itself. As we move deeper into this chapter, you'll see just how dramatic these consequences could be. Future sections will explore marriages that directly triggered political crises, heirs whose frailty altered the fate of kingdoms, and moments where dynastic obsession led to near catastrophe. This isn't just history on a map. It's history lived in the bodies, minds, and hearts of the people who were both rulers and victims of their own family strategies. Some of the most dramatic consequences of dynastic bloodlines were political, and they often played out like high-stakes drama on the European stage. Take the Spanish succession crisis, for instance. Charles II of Spain, frail and childless, left a vacuum that shook the continent. The careful web of Habsburg alliances, meticulously planned over generations, suddenly became a source of instability. Nations that had relied on marriage to secure peace were now facing the very opposite: war. The War of Spanish Succession erupted, with multiple claimants fighting for the throne, reshaping borders and redefining power across Europe. All of this stemmed from the unintended consequences of generations of concentrated bloodlines, a reminder that even the most brilliant dynastic strategy could backfire catastrophically. In France, the Bourbons faced their own domino effects. Louis XIV's strategic marriages were designed to secure influence, yet they often produced fragile heirs or unexpected outcomes. The fragility of these children, combined with political ambition and the ever-present threat of rebellion, created tension that could not always be managed with diplomacy. Courtiers, ministers, and foreign powers all watched closely, ready to exploit any weakness. What began as a private family concern often became a public political crisis, demonstrating the inseparability of personal tragedy and national consequence. Even England, which seemed at times more stable, experienced similar shocks. Henry VIII's marital history set a precedent for instability, succession disputes, and religious upheaval. Edward VI's early death, Mary I's contested reign, and Elizabeth I's unmarried status created a political landscape where alliances were constantly in flux. Each monarch's health, temperament, and personal decisions were magnified in importance, showing how dynastic and personal tragedies could ripple across entire nations. These weren't isolated events. They were interconnected crises shaped by centuries of strategic marriages and their human consequences. In Austria, the Habsburgs continued to grapple with internal fragility. Archdukes and archduchesses were expected to produce heirs to maintain influence, yet repeated close-kin unions made successful, healthy heirs increasingly uncertain. Political advisors and family members were forced to make difficult decisions, balancing dynastic ambition with biological reality. The line between strategy and tragedy was razor thin. One sickly child could destabilize centuries of planning, while a single miscalculated marriage could shift alliances across the continent. These crises weren't purely hypothetical, they had tangible consequences. Wars were fought, treaties were rewritten, and entire regions were plunged into uncertainty because heirs were weak, absent, or incapable of ruling. Political rivals seized opportunities created by personal misfortune. Dynastic marriages, intended as tools of stability, sometimes became the very mechanisms that triggered instability. The irony is striking. The same strategy that had produced sprawling empires could also bring them to the brink of collapse. Consider Maria Theresa of Spain and her marriage into the Austrian Habsburg line. Intended to strengthen ties and consolidate influence, this union also brought hereditary vulnerabilities. Their descendants faced health challenges that affected both personal lives and political stability. Similarly, in France, Bourbon marriages designed to expand influence sometimes resulted in fragile heirs, triggering disputes that could weaken the dynasty's hold on power. These examples illustrate that in the world of dynastic strategy, nothing was ever guaranteed. Every plan carried risk, and the stakes were nothing less than the survival of kingdoms. The personal toll on these royals was immense. Children were trained from infancy to understand the political significance of their existence. Every action, every failure, and every illness had consequences beyond themselves. They were living instruments of history, expected to fulfill roles that combined diplomacy, succession, and public perception, while simultaneously bearing the biological consequences of generations of inbreeding. It's a perspective that's hard to fully grasp today, but it underlines just how precarious life could be within these dynasties. And yet, despite the tragedies, dynasties continued to pursue these strategies. The rewards were too great: power, influence, and the perception of divine right. Even when faced with repeated evidence of fragility, monarchs often doubled down on intermarriage, convinced that political gain outweighed personal cost. This relentless pursuit of dynastic perfection created a cycle where ambition and biology constantly collided, producing a mix of brilliance, tragedy, and unpredictability that would define European history for centuries. By the mid-17th century, Europe had become a living illustration of the paradox of dynastic strategy. The same marriages that expanded empires also concentrated weaknesses. The same heirs who embodied power were also carriers of fragility. The careful weaving of family networks, once seen as the key to continental dominance, had created an intricate web of potential collapse. Each generation inherited both the power of history and the vulnerabilities embedded in their own blood, making dynastic life as perilous as it was privileged. As this section closes, it's clear that the tragedies of dynastic bloodlines were not simply personal, they were historical. Every weakness, every frail heir, every miscalculated marriage sent ripples through Europe's political landscape. The story of these families is a story of ambition, strategy, and the fragile, often tragic humanity at the heart of it all. In the next section, we'll examine individual marriages and heirs in detail, showing how specific unions triggered crises, reshaped nations, and left legacies that historians still analyse centuries later. Across Europe, particular marriages became turning points, not just for the families involved but for entire kingdoms. Take the union of Maria Anna of Spain and Ferdinand III of Austria. Politically, it made perfect sense. It strengthened ties between Spain and the Austrian Habsburgs and reinforced influence across the continent. Yet the marriage also intensified the risks already present in a lineage built on intermarriage. Their children faced the compounded consequences of concentrated bloodlines, including frailty and health complications, which would shape the Austrian Habsburg legacy for decades. In France, Louis XIV's children were similarly shaped by the pressures of dynastic planning. Marriages arranged for political gain often placed young heirs under extreme stress. Illnesses, untimely deaths, and constant surveillance created an environment where even ordinary childhood challenges became amplified, shaping not just personalities, but the future of nations. For the Bourbons, a fragile heir was more than a personal concern. It was a potential trigger for political instability, a factor that neighbouring countries watched closely, ready to exploit any vulnerability. The Habsburgs, however, offer perhaps the clearest illustration of the collision between ambition and biology. Charles II of Spain, known historically as the Bewitched, had inherited centuries of carefully orchestrated marriages, yet his frailty and disabilities left Spain in a precarious position. Foreign powers seized the opportunity to challenge the succession, plunging Europe into the War of Spanish Succession. Charles's life and incapacity had consequences far beyond his own court. They altered the balance of power on an entire continent. Every detail, from his health struggles to the political manoeuvring surrounding his reign, demonstrates the high stakes of dynastic obsession. Meanwhile, England faced its own version of dynastic turbulence. The Tudors' insistence on securing a male heir created a cycle of personal and political strain. Edward VI ascended the throne as a sickly child, and his short reign left England vulnerable. Mary I, burdened with her own familial expectations and political pressures, struggled to maintain control amid religious tension and domestic unrest. Elizabeth I, choosing not to marry, confronted the challenges of succession in a way that highlighted the intricate balance between personal choice and dynastic necessity. Each monarch's life was a testament to how human frailty could influence national destiny. Even minor traits within these dynasties carried outsized consequences. The Habsburg jaw, a physical feature that became increasingly pronounced over generations, serves as a visible symbol of the hidden risks of repeated intermarriage. It represented the careful but dangerous strategy of consolidating bloodlines to maintain political power. What began as a calculated decision for territorial security and alliance building ultimately produced tangible biological consequences that could influence both the individual and the state. In addition to physical health, mental and emotional strain played a critical role. Children born into these dynasties were trained from an early age to carry the weight of family expectations. Every action, every failure, every illness had significance beyond personal consequence. These royals were living instruments of history, expected to preserve dynastic prestige while coping with the psychological and physical burdens imposed by generations of strategy. The cumulative effect of this pressure often manifested in fragile personalities, anxiety, and a heightened vulnerability to illness, all of which could impact succession and political stability. Political consequences often followed swiftly. Wars, alliances, and succession disputes were intertwined with the health and decisions of individual heirs. The fragile body of a prince or princess could spark continental upheaval. When a young Habsburg fell ill, or a Bourbon heir failed to survive childhood, rival powers seized the opportunity to shift alliances, lay claim to disputed territories, or even challenge entire thrones. Dynastic planning had created unprecedented influence, but it also made these empires extraordinarily sensitive to the personal vulnerabilities of their members. In some cases, these pressures led to unexpected rebellions or internal court conflict. Advisors, relatives, and even spouses might maneuver for influence, exploiting weaknesses in heirs to advance their own power. The result was often a complex tangle of intrigue, betrayal, and tension that extended far beyond family quarrels. The line between personal tragedy and political crisis blurred, creating stories that are as compelling as any fictional drama. By the late 17th century, Europe's royal families had become a delicate ecosystem. Strategic marriages created sprawling networks of influence, but those same networks were riddled with risk. Physical frailty, mental strain, and unpredictable outcomes created instability that could undo centuries of careful planning. Dynasties were simultaneously powerful and fragile, brilliant in strategy yet vulnerable in execution. The interplay of human biology, personal ambition, and political necessity shaped the fate of nations in ways that were both dramatic and unavoidable. As this section closes, it's clear that the human cost of dynastic strategy was enormous. Royal children lived under intense scrutiny. Political alliances were always at risk, and fragile heirs could inadvertently trigger historical upheaval. These stories illustrate the dual nature of dynastic planning. It could consolidate power and influence, but it could also create the very vulnerabilities that threaten the stability of empires. In the next section, we'll examine how specific marriages directly triggered wars, succession crises, and political collapses, showing the tangible consequences of dynastic obsession in full, dramatic detail. By the late 17th century, certain marriages had not just shaped dynasties, they had reshaped Europe. One striking example is the union of Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, and Margaret Theresa of Spain. On paper, it was perfect, a union designed to solidify Habsburg influence across Spain and Austria. In reality, it produced a fragile line of heirs and a series of political complications. Their children faced illness and premature death, leaving succession uncertain and fueling tensions among European powers. The carefully plotted strategy of consolidating power through marriage instead generated uncertainty and instability, a recurring theme in dynastic history. In France, Louis XIV's daughter, Marie-Thérèse, married Philip V of Spain. Again, politics dictated the match, cementing alliances meant to stabilise relations between France and Spain. Yet the human cost was undeniable. Philip's mental health and temper, combined with the pressures placed on Marie-Thérèse as a mother and queen, contributed to personal struggles that had ripple effects on both courts. Their descendants would face similar health and succession challenges, reinforcing the lesson that dynastic ambition often came at the expense of individual well-being. England also witnessed the consequences of dynastic ambition. The marriage of James II to Mary of Modena, while politically expedient, created succession anxieties. Their son, James Francis Edward Stuart, known as the Old Pretender, became a focal point of political tension in Britain and across Europe. Questions of legitimacy, religion, and succession triggered rebellions and wars, showing that the repercussions of strategic marriages could extend far beyond family courts into full-scale political crises. Even smaller kingdoms were not immune. In Scandinavia, repeated dynastic unions created fragile heirs, whose inability to rule effectively opened doors for foreign influence and internal unrest. The ripple effects of a single marriage could destabilize an entire region, underscoring just how intertwined human biology and political strategy had become. Dynasties had built elaborate systems of alliances and influence, but the fragility of individual heirs often dictated the fate of nations. These tragic patterns were reinforced by a culture that prized dynastic purity above all else. Marriages between close relatives were seen as essential to maintaining the divine bloodline, even when the consequences were evident. Over generations, families like the Habsburgs and Bourbons became testaments to both strategic brilliance and biological vulnerability. The more tightly the bloodlines were controlled, the higher the risk that an heir would carry both the weight of history and the consequences of intermarriage. The psychological burden on these young royals cannot be overstated. Children born into these dynasties were expected to understand their political and dynastic importance from an early age. Failures, illnesses, or even ordinary human weaknesses could have implications far beyond the personal, sometimes determining the survival of a kingdom. The interplay between individual fragility and historical consequence created a unique environment where personal tragedies became political events, and where dynastic ambition intersected with biology in ways that shaped the entire continent. By the early 18th century, the cumulative effect of these dynastic tragedies was clear. Entire empires had been strengthened, expanded, and sometimes maintained through strategic marriages, but always with hidden costs. Fragile heirs, contested successions, and political instability were the price paid for centuries of intermarriage and dynastic planning. Wars, treaties, and diplomacy were often dictated as much by the health and capabilities of heirs as by the ambitions of kings and ministers. The personal and political were inseparably intertwined. One of the most poignant lessons from this era is that no amount of strategy could fully control human biology or personal circumstance. Dynasties could plan meticulously, but illness, frailty, and untimely death often upended even the most brilliant calculations. history was shaped not only by ambition and diplomacy, but by the fragile lives of the people whose bloodlines carried the weight of empires. The consequences of these tragedies were felt for generations, influencing succession, governance, and the balance of power across Europe. As we now know, dynastic marriages were far more than private unions. They were instruments of power, tools of strategy, and catalysts for both political and personal tragedy. Europe's royal families were simultaneously brilliant and vulnerable, their influence stretching across continents, yet built on foundations that were often fragile, human, and unpredictable. The stories of fragile heirs, disastrous unions, and dynastic crises remind us that history is not just a series of dates and treaties. It is lived, human drama, where the consequences of ambition ripple across generations. Next, we'll be exploring how dynastic obsession created catastrophic consequences in real time, including wars, rebellions, and dramatic shifts in European power. We'll dive into the lives of rulers and heirs as they navigated these pressures, highlighting moments where personal tragedy directly shaped the political landscape. The stage is set for a chapter that blends history, human drama, and the high stakes of dynastic ambition in a way that feels almost cinematic, yet remains rooted in real events. By the turn of the 18th century, Europe's meticulously crafted dynasties were facing a reality they could no longer control. Generations of intermarriage had produced heirs who were frail, vulnerable, or absent altogether. Political stability, once reinforced through strategic unions, was now hanging by a thread. The stage was set for crises, rebellions, and wars that would redraw the map of Europe and test the limits of dynastic ambition. The War of the Spanish Succession is the perfect entry point into this chaos. When Charles II of Spain died childless in 1700, the careful web of Habsburg alliances unravelled almost overnight. Louis XIV of France, citing his grandson Philip of Anjou as heir, sparked fears across Europe that France would dominate the continent. England, the Dutch Republic, Austria, and others formed alliances to oppose this consolidation of power. What began as a succession issue fueled a continental conflict that lasted over a decade, proving just how much the fate of nations could hinge on a single fragile heir. Meanwhile, in Austria, the Habsburgs faced their own dynastic anxieties. Archduke Joseph, heir to the Holy Roman Empire, was thrust into political responsibility at a young age. His life and reign were heavily influenced by the expectation that he would preserve the Habsburg legacy despite the frailties that had accumulated in his lineage. Advisors and ministers constantly monitored his health, education, and marital alliances, understanding that any misstep could destabilize not just Austria, but the balance of power across Europe. France's Bourbons were not immune to similar pressures. Louis XIV had spent decades carefully arranging marriages and alliances to expand influence, yet fragile heirs and complex court politics created vulnerabilities. When heirs were weak or ill, factions within the court quickly seized opportunities, sometimes leading to internal disputes that threatened the monarchy's stability. The personal health and choices of a single prince or princess had ripple effects that could alter treaties, alliances, and even spark conflicts. Across smaller kingdoms and principalities, the pattern was repeated. In Scandinavia, dynastic intermarriage had created fragile heirs whose inability to rule effectively left space for external influence and internal unrest. In the Italian states, strategic marriages frequently produced heirs who were unprepared for leadership, causing political turbulence that invited foreign intervention. Every fragile child, every premature death, every ill-fated union could tip the balance of regional politics. Wars during this period were not just battles over territory, they were extensions of dynastic struggles. The succession disputes in Spain, Austria, and France demonstrate that political ambition and human vulnerability were inseparable. Dynasties had engineered power across Europe, but the fragile airs they produced often became catalysts for conflict. Political boundaries, alliances, and military strategies were constantly shaped by the lives, and sometimes the deaths, of individual royals. The personal stakes for these rulers were immense. A fragile prince or princess did not simply risk personal health. They risked triggering wars, rebellions, or crises that could engulf entire regions. Court intrigue intensified as ministers, nobles, and foreign powers manoeuvred around these weaknesses. Dynasties were no longer insulated by blood alone. They were exposed to the unpredictability of human biology, the ambitions of rivals, and the pressures of public expectation. Even successful marriages could have unintended consequences. When Philip of Anjou became Philip V of Spain, his French Bourbon bloodline stirred fears of continental domination. Diplomacy, war, and negotiation became tools not just to expand power, but to contain it. Alliances formed and collapsed with shocking speed, often dictated by the fragility or decisions of heirs. Dynastic strategy, once a source of security, now contributed to instability in dramatic and unpredictable ways. Europe's political landscape at this time was, in many ways, a living illustration of the tension between human ambition and biological limitation. Dynasties could plan meticulously, engineer marriages, and expand influence, but they could not control the fragility of heirs or the cascade of consequences that followed. History was no longer just the story of kings and queens. It was a story of fragile human lives shaping empires, of strategic planning colliding with reality, and of personal tragedy influencing the course of nations. The War of the Spanish Succession wasn't just a battle over territory. It was a war born from fragile dynasties, strategic marriages, and the absence of a strong heir. When Charles II of Spain died without a successor, Europe was thrust into chaos. Louis XIV of France claimed the throne for his grandson, Philip of Anjou, igniting fears that France would dominate Spain and potentially the entire continent. The war that followed drew in England, the Dutch Republic, Austria, and several smaller powers, turning what could have been a contained succession dispute into a decade-long continental conflict. The political manoeuvring behind the scenes was intense. Diplomats and monarchs had spent decades arranging marriages to secure alliances, yet a single childless king upended everything. Charles II's frailty and lack of heirs illustrated how the fragility of one individual could destabilize entire nations. Advisors, ministers, and foreign powers monitored every detail, knowing that the future of Europe hung on decisions made by the smallest group of people in royal courts. The stakes were nothing less than global, and the consequences of dynastic weakness played out on the battlefield. Austria, under the Habsburgs, faced a similarly tense situation. Archduke Joseph, heir to the Holy Roman Empire, had to navigate a world where his own family's fragility had direct consequences for European politics. The emperor's advisors pushed for strategic marriages, carefully monitoring alliances and succession lines, aware that a single misstep could cost territories, influence, or even provoke war. Dynastic planning had become a high-stakes chess game, where each move had both personal and political consequences, and the lives of fragile heirs were central to the strategy. Meanwhile, France experienced internal tension, as the Bourbons grappled with the implications of Philip V's new Spanish crown. Louis XIV's ambition had secured his grandson's position, but it also sparked resistance from within France and abroad. Court factions jockeyed for influence, monitoring Philip's health and political decisions closely. Every illness, every perceived weakness, and every personal choice was magnified in importance. Dynastic strategy had successfully expanded influence, but it had also created vulnerabilities that enemies and allies alike were eager to exploit. England and the Dutch Republic, acting as counterweights, capitalized on these vulnerabilities. Wars were waged not only on the battlefield but also through diplomacy, alliances, and economic pressure. Every fragile heir, every contested marriage, and every death in the royal family became leverage. The succession crisis in Spain had evolved into a continental conflict, demonstrating that dynastic fragility was never just a personal matter. It shaped treaties, military campaigns, and the political fate of entire regions. Smaller dynasties and kingdoms were caught in the crossfire as well. In Italy, the Habsburg influence extended through strategic marriages that connected northern principalities. Yet when heirs proved fragile or incapable, power vacuums emerged, inviting foreign influence and internal disputes. Scandinavia saw similar dynamics. Repeated dynastic intermarriage created fragile heirs who struggled to maintain control, opening opportunities for external powers to intervene. Across Europe, the health and decisions of a few royals had ripple effects that shaped the continent's political landscape. One of the most striking lessons from this period is the scale at which personal tragedy intersected with geopolitics. A sickly prince, a childless king, or a fragile queen could determine whether nations went to war or signed peace. Political strategy and dynastic planning had created networks of influence across Europe, but those same networks were extremely sensitive to human frailty. Wars like the Spanish Succession, rebellions, and contested successions were often triggered not by ambition alone, but by the consequences of fragile bloodlines. The human element was always at the centre. Princes, princesses, and heirs were not just symbols. They were decision-makers whose personal health and capabilities directly influenced the outcomes of wars and treaties. Advisors, ministers, and foreign powers all understood this, treating royal lives as both assets and vulnerabilities. Dynasties had amassed power over generations, but those centuries of planning could be undone by a single weak heir or an untimely death. It's a reminder that history, while often written in dates and treaties, is also shaped by fragile, very human lives. As this section closes, the interplay of dynastic fragility, political strategy, and continental warfare becomes clear. Europe was a chessboard, and the pieces, kings, queens, and heirs, were simultaneously powerful and fragile. Succession crises, wars, and political intrigue were never random. They were consequences of centuries of strategy meeting the unpredictability of human biology. Dynasties could engineer influence, but they could not fully control the consequences of their own ambitions. The War of the Spanish Succession was defined by both strategy and human vulnerability. On the battlefield, generals and soldiers moved with precision, but the larger picture was dominated by fragile dynasties and the consequences of succession disputes. Philip of Anjou, barely settled on the Spanish throne, faced immense pressure from foreign powers determined to limit his influence. France and Spain were aligned by blood, but every decision carried the weight of fragile health, political expectation, and centuries of interwoven alliances. One misstep could spark disaster, and history was watching closely. In the Austrian Habsburg territories, Archduke Charles, later Charles VI, was positioned as a rival claimant. His claim was reinforced by decades of dynastic planning, yet his personal circumstances were far from ideal. Health concerns, political rivals within the court, and the enormous responsibility of leading armies created a high-stakes environment where every move was scrutinised. Court advisors constantly debated strategy, marriage alliances, and the timing of military campaigns, aware that a weak heir or poor decision could tip the balance of Europe. Meanwhile, the French court was navigating its own crises. Louis XIV, at the height of his power, had invested heavily in Philip's claim, yet the complexities of international politics meant that success was never guaranteed. Allies were unreliable, rivals were opportunistic, and even a minor illness or delayed marriage could have major repercussions. Philip's ability to rule effectively was under constant observation, and the fragile health and temperament of heirs became more than a personal concern. They became a matter of national security. Battles themselves reflected the fragility of dynasties. Generals and soldiers executed precise manoeuvres, But the strategies were often influenced by the perceived weaknesses of royal figures. A commander's decision could be shaped by the health of a prince, the legitimacy of a claim, or the potential consequences of succession disputes. Wars during this period were as much about human calculation and perception as they were about terrain and weaponry. The fates of kingdoms often rested on the vulnerabilities of a single individual, and every casualty had the potential to alter the political landscape in profound ways. Even minor European courts experienced ripple effects. In Italy, fragmented principalities watched the outcomes in Spain and Austria closely, knowing that fragile heirs could lead to foreign intervention or shifts in alliances. Scandinavia's smaller kingdoms faced similar challenges, as intermarriage had produced heirs whose ability to rule effectively was uncertain. Fragility, in both body and mind, became a decisive factor in regional politics, demonstrating that dynastic weakness could have consequences far beyond the immediate family. Diplomatic negotiations were equally shaped by dynastic realities. Treaties were not only about borders and armies, they were about heirs, marriages, and the long-term implications of fragile bloodlines. Envoys considered succession lines and health status as carefully as they did troop movements. Every royal's ability to fulfill dynastic expectations influenced alliances, economic agreements, and even the timing of military campaigns. The human element was inseparable from strategy, and dynastic fragility became a decisive factor in shaping Europe's political and military landscape. Political factions within courts capitalized on fragile heirs. Advisors, relatives, and foreign agents sought opportunities to influence or manipulate outcomes, exploiting the vulnerabilities of those in power. Fragile princes, childless kings, or incapacitated heirs created openings for intrigue, rebellion, and shifts in influence. Court life became a high-stakes game of chess, where every personal weakness could cascade into regional or continental upheaval. History, in this sense, was as much the product of fragile humans as it was of strategy and ambition. The consequences of dynastic fragility were not abstract. They were measured in human lives, armies lost or won, territories gained or lost, and the shifting fortunes of nations. Charles II's death, Philip of Anjou's succession, and Archduke Charles's claim illustrate how fragile heirs could ignite wars that reshaped Europe. Dynasties had engineered influence over centuries, but the unpredictability of human biology and circumstance repeatedly demonstrated that power was never absolute. Internal court crises became almost as consequential as battles on the battlefield. In France, factions within the Bourbon court constantly jockeyed for influence, exploiting the fragility of heirs and the health of Philip V. Advisors and relatives were acutely aware that a single misstep by the young king could tip the balance of power, so intrigue became a tool just as vital as armies or treaties. Courtiers leveraged minor illnesses, rumours, and strategic marriages to secure advantages, proving that the personal weaknesses of royal figures could have consequences that extended far beyond the palace walls. Austria faced similar turmoil. Archduke Charles's claim to the Spanish throne was not universally accepted, and political rivals both inside and outside the Habsburg territories sought to capitalize on any sign of weakness. Succession disputes, contested claims, and factional intrigue intensified as allies maneuvered to protect their interests and adversaries plotted to exploit instability. The Habsburgs' reputation for meticulous dynastic planning was constantly challenged by the unpredictable consequences of fragile heirs, creating a landscape of political tension that was as intense inside palace walls as it was on European battlefields. Even minor principalities saw ripple effects. In the Italian states, the fragility of heirs could trigger rebellions or invite foreign intervention. In Scandinavia, repeated intermarriage had produced rulers who were physically or mentally vulnerable, making them susceptible to manipulation and pressure from powerful neighbours. The political consequences of dynastic fragility were pervasive, demonstrating that a single weak heir could shift the balance of an entire region. Religion also played a role in amplifying crises. In England, the Catholic succession under James II triggered fears that were compounded by his son's legitimacy and health concerns. This combination of dynastic vulnerability and religious tension led to the Glorious Revolution, where Parliament and external powers intervened to secure the throne. Personal frailty in this case had a profound impact on national identity, governance, and the very direction of the country's history. The intersection of dynastic fragility and religious politics underscores just how high the stakes could become. The consequences extended beyond politics into society itself. Fragile heirs and contested successions affected taxation, military conscription, and even trade policies. Nobility and commoners alike felt the ripple effects of a sickly prince or childless king. When succession was uncertain, political decisions slowed or became erratic, wars were prolonged, and regional economies could falter. Dynastic fragility was not confined to palace intrigue. It shaped the daily lives of millions across Europe. Court advisors often turned fragile heirs into instruments of broader political strategy. In France and Austria, young princes and princesses were trained not just in diplomacy, but in surviving a high-stakes environment where illness or failure could spark political upheaval. Their marriages were carefully calculated, their public appearances orchestrated, and their health monitored constantly. The pressures were immense, and the personal cost was high. Every decision, even a minor one, could have implications that reached far beyond their own lives. Wars, rebellions, and succession disputes were therefore inseparable from human frailty. The War of Spanish Succession, the Glorious Revolution, and the internal factional conflicts within courts all demonstrate that dynasties were as vulnerable as they were powerful. Strategic planning could create influence, but fragile heirs introduced unpredictability that no advisor or diplomat could fully control. The outcomes of these events remind us that history is often shaped by the intersection of human limitation and ambition. By mid-century, Europe's royal families were living examples of this tension. Generations of intermarriage had produced fragile heirs whose lives carried consequences far beyond the personal. Political manoeuvring, wars, and succession crises were all influenced by the human vulnerabilities at the heart of these dynasties. The grandeur of the courts mastered delicate reality. Empires could rise or fall based on the frailty of a single individual. In this sense, the human and political drama of dynastic Europe was inseparable, each feeding the other in a complex dance of power and vulnerability. The lives of these royals illustrate a striking paradox. They were the most powerful people in Europe, yet they were profoundly vulnerable. Their health, temperament, and personal decisions dictated the fate of nations. Courts were rife with intrigue, armies were deployed to protect or contest fragile claims, and diplomacy revolved around the condition and legitimacy of heirs. History during this period was alive with tension, drama, and the constant interplay between human fragility and dynastic ambition. Internal court crises became almost as consequential as battles on the battlefield. In France, factions within the Bourbon court constantly jockeyed for influence, exploiting the fragility of heirs and the health of Philip V. Advisors and relatives were acutely aware that a single misstep by the young king could tip the balance of power, so intrigue became a tool just as vital as armies or treaties. Courtiers leveraged minor illnesses, rumours, and strategic marriages to secure advantages, proving that the personal weaknesses of royal figures could have consequences that extended far beyond the palace walls. Austria faced similar turmoil. Archduke Charles's claim to the Spanish throne was not universally accepted, and political rivals both inside and outside the Habsburg territories sought to capitalize on any sign of weakness. Succession disputes, contested claims, and factional intrigue intensified as allies maneuvered to protect their interests and adversaries plotted to exploit instability. The Habsburgs' reputation for meticulous dynastic planning was constantly challenged by the unpredictable consequences of fragile heirs, creating a landscape of political tension that was as intense inside palace walls as it was on European battlefields. Even minor principalities saw ripple effects. In the Italian states, the fragility of heirs could trigger rebellions or invite foreign intervention. In Scandinavia, repeated intermarriage had produced rulers who were physically or mentally vulnerable, making them susceptible to manipulation and pressure from powerful neighbours. The political consequences of dynastic fragility were pervasive, demonstrating that a single weak heir could shift the balance of an entire region. Religion also played a role in amplifying crises. In England, the Catholic succession under James II triggered fears that were compounded by his son's legitimacy and health concerns. This combination of dynastic vulnerability and religious tension led to the Glorious Revolution, where Parliament and external powers intervened to secure the throne. Personal frailty, in this case, had a profound impact on national identity, governance, and the very direction of the country's history. The intersection of dynastic fragility and religious politics underscores just how high the stakes could become. The consequences extended beyond politics into society itself. Fragile heirs and contested successions affected taxation, military conscription, and even trade policies. Nobility and commoners alike felt the ripple effects of a sickly prince or childless king. When succession was uncertain, political decisions slowed or became erratic, wars were prolonged, and regional economies could falter. Dynastic fragility was not confined to palace intrigue. It shaped the daily lives of millions across Europe. Court advisors often turned fragile heirs into instruments of broader political strategy. In France and Austria, young princes and princesses were trained not just in diplomacy, but in surviving a high-stakes environment where illness or failure could spark political upheaval. Their marriages were carefully calculated, their public appearances orchestrated, and their health monitored constantly. The pressures were immense, and the personal cost was high. Every decision, even a minor one, could have implications that reached far beyond their own lives. Wars, rebellions, and succession disputes were therefore inseparable from human frailty. The War of Spanish Succession, the Glorious Revolution, and the internal factional conflicts within courts all demonstrate that dynasties were as vulnerable as they were powerful. Strategic planning could create influence, but fragile heirs introduced unpredictability that no advisor or diplomat could fully control. The outcomes of these events remind us that history is often shaped by the intersection of human limitation and ambition. By mid-century, Europe's royal families were living examples of this tension. Generations of intermarriage had produced fragile heirs whose lives carried consequences far beyond the personal. Political manoeuvring, wars, and succession crises were all influenced by the human vulnerabilities at the heart of these dynasties. The grandeur of the courts masked a delicate reality. Empires could rise or fall based on the frailty of a single individual. In this sense, the human and political drama of dynastic Europe was inseparable, each feeding the other in a complex dance of power and vulnerability. The lives of these royals illustrate a striking paradox. They were the most powerful people in Europe, yet they were profoundly vulnerable. Their health, temperament, and personal decisions dictated the fate of nations. Courts were rife with intrigue, armies were deployed to protect or contest fragile claims, and diplomacy revolved around the condition and legitimacy of heirs. History during this period was alive with tension, drama, and the constant interplay between human fragility and dynastic ambition. By the end of the War of the Spanish Succession, the consequences of dynastic fragility were impossible to ignore. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 redrew borders, shifted alliances, and redistributed power across Europe. But the underlying cause, the vulnerabilities embedded in centuries of intermarriage, remained. Charles II's death, the lack of a strong heir, and the fragile health of key figures had set off a chain reaction that no army or diplomat could fully contain. Dynasties had engineered power over centuries, yet the lives of a few individuals had rewritten the map of Europe. Philip V managed to consolidate his rule in Spain, but his reign was marked by constant concern over succession and legitimacy. Even after decades of war, the Bourbon grip on Spain remained contingent on the health and decisions of heirs. Courts across Europe continued to monitor marriages, births, and deaths, understanding that dynastic fragility could reignite conflict at any moment. Power, it seemed, was never fully secure, even for the most entrenched families. In Austria, the Habsburgs recalibrated after the loss of the Spanish throne. Archduke Charles, despite personal success and political acumen, had witnessed firsthand how fragile heirs and contested succession could destabilize entire empires. The Habsburg strategy evolved to balance political ambition with awareness of biological limitations, yet the fundamental tension remained. Dynasties were only as strong as the heirs who carried them forward. Generations of intermarriage had left the empire simultaneously powerful and vulnerable. France's Bourbon faced similar realities. Louis XIV, who had spent a lifetime crafting alliances and expanding influence, saw the fragility of dynastic ambition exposed through Philip's precarious position. Court factions, external powers, and the unpredictable outcomes of succession reminded everyone that even the most brilliant political strategies were contingent on human vulnerability. Dynasties, for all their wealth and planning, were ultimately bound by the limitations of biology. Even smaller European states felt the shockwaves of these crises. Italian principalities, Scandinavian kingdoms, and Eastern European duchies were drawn into conflicts they could not control, often as pawns in the struggles between fragile dynasties. A single weak heir could invite foreign intervention or trigger internal revolts, proving that the fates of minor kingdoms were inseparable from the health and succession of Europe's great families. Dynastic fragility, therefore, was both a personal tragedy and a geopolitical reality. The human toll of these dynastic crises was profound. Princes and princesses lived under constant pressure, aware that illness, incapacity, or untimely death could have catastrophic consequences. Children were trained from birth to fulfill political and dynastic expectations, and their personal well-being was inseparable from the stability of empires. Families that seemed invincible from the outside were often precarious behind closed doors, their power contingent on the survival and health of fragile heirs. Political lessons from this period are clear. Strategic marriages, intermarriage, and dynastic planning could consolidate influence, expand empires, and create the perception of invulnerability. But they also concentrated risk. Fragile heirs, contested successions, and the human unpredictability of birth and health could undo centuries of careful planning. Dynasties were living systems, vulnerable in ways that armies, treasuries, or treaties could not fully mitigate. History, as always, was shaped by human frailty as much as by ambition. By the mid-18th century, Europe had adapted to these lessons, but the tension between dynastic ambition and fragility never disappeared. Families continued to pursue strategic marriages, yet awareness of the consequences of concentrated bloodlines grew. Monarchs understood that the fates of their empires were intertwined with the health, temperament, and survival of heirs. Courts were cautious, advisors vigilant, and marriages scrutinized with a new intensity, but the underlying paradox remained. Power and fragility were inseparable in Europe's royal families. The story of this era is a testament to the human dimension of history. Dynastic ambition created vast empires, shaped borders, and triggered wars, but the most powerful decisions were often influenced by the most fragile people. Princes, princesses, and heirs carried the weight of generations, and their personal vulnerabilities had consequences that stretched across continents. Dynastic strategy, while brilliant, could not eliminate the unpredictability of human life. Fragile heirs, contested successions, and dynastic ambition created a Europe that was constantly in flux. Wars were waged, treaties signed, and empires expanded or contracted. But behind it all were the human stories of royals navigating the pressures of their bloodlines. Dynastic fragility shaped history. illustrating that power, for all its grandeur, was inseparable from human vulnerability. The legacies of these families are a vivid reminder that history is as much about fragile lives as it is about empires and ambition. By the mid-18th century, the dust of the Spanish succession and other dynastic conflicts had settled, but the consequences lingered like shadows over Europe's royal houses. Fragile heirs, contested marriages, and the relentless pursuit of dynastic influence had left courts cautious, alliances tentative, and kingdoms more aware than ever of the precariousness of power. Dynastic ambition had produced both expansion and vulnerability, and families across Europe were grappling with the lessons of the past century. Spain, under Philip V, exemplified this delicate balance. He had survived wars, rebellions, and internal court intrigue, but his health and succession continued to be a source of concern. Each marriage and birth was scrutinized not only for its political implications, but for its potential to stabilize or destabilize the kingdom. Philip's descendants carried both the promise of continuity and the threat of fragility, reminding everyone that the fates of nations were often entwined with the bodies and lives of heirs. Austria, too, was redefining its strategy. The Habsburgs had weathered wars and succession disputes, but the fragility of heirs remained a constant consideration. Archduke Charles had assumed leadership during tumultuous times, but his family's future depended on carefully managed marriages and vigilance over the health of children. Every generation inherited both political ambition and biological vulnerability, creating a persistent tension between power and human limitation. In France, the Bourbon court faced similar realities. Louis XV, ascending to the throne as a child, was surrounded by advisors who understood the stakes of dynastic fragility. Court politics revolved not only around power and influence, but around the health and legitimacy of heirs. Every royal birth or death could shift alliances, embolden factions, or provoke unrest. Dynastic strategy had expanded France's influence, but it had also created a system highly sensitive to human frailty. Smaller European kingdoms continued to feel the ripple effects of these fragile dynasties. In Italy, the intricate network of princely marriages required constant monitoring. In Scandinavia, intermarriage had produced heirs whose capabilities were uncertain, making foreign intervention a persistent threat. Even minor courts were influenced by the outcomes of distant dynastic struggles, demonstrating how interconnected European politics had become. Fragile heirs had consequences that extended far beyond palace walls, affecting diplomacy, trade, and regional stability. The human element remained at the centre of power. Royal children were trained from birth to understand their importance, yet the pressures they faced were immense. Illness, temperament, or untimely death could undo years of planning and destabilize entire regions. The personal and political were inseparable. Every decision, every marriage, every health crisis carried consequences that echoed through generations. Dynasties were living systems, dependent not only on strategy, but on the frail bodies and minds of their heirs. Diplomatic maneuvering in this period reflected these realities. Treaties, alliances, and negotiations often revolved around the prospects of royal succession. Envoys and monarchs alike assessed the health, legitimacy, and marital prospects of heirs as carefully as they did armies or fortifications. The fragility of a single prince or princess could dictate whether a treaty succeeded or failed, whether peace held or war broke out. Dynastic planning had created influence, but it had also created profound vulnerability. Even after wars ended and borders stabilized, the legacy of fragile bloodlines remained. Monarchs knew that their influence was conditional, tied to the survival and capability of their heirs. Courtiers, ministers, and foreign powers all watched carefully, ready to exploit weakness or capitalize on opportunity. The lessons of the previous century, wars sparked by contested succession, fragile heirs, and intermarriage, shaped decision-making, highlighting the intricate interplay between biology, politics, and history. The personal cost to royal families was immense. Children born into these dynasties carried the weight of centuries of ambition, often at the expense of their own health and well-being. Families faced constant tension between the desire for political advantage and the limitations of human biology. Every royal birth, every illness, and every death became a matter of state, illustrating that dynastic ambition was inseparable from personal fragility. As the century progressed, Europe's royal houses became more cautious, but the fundamental tension remained. Dynastic ambition could expand influence, secure alliances, and project power, but it could never eliminate the human vulnerabilities at its core. The histories of the Bourbons, Habsburgs, and other major dynasties demonstrate that even the most brilliant strategies were contingent on the unpredictable realities of life, health, and succession. After the major wars had settled, dynastic marriages remained the primary tool for securing influence across Europe. For the Bourbons and Habsburgs, the stakes were higher than ever. One fragile heir or miscalculated union could undo decades of careful planning. Louis XV of France, for example, understood that his marriage choices would not only shape his immediate succession, but also the broader network of alliances across the continent. Every engagement, every bride, and every birth was scrutinized, with political ramifications stretching far beyond Versailles. Austria approached the same challenge with equal diligence. Maria Theresa, the daughter of Emperor Charles VI, would become a living embodiment of dynastic strategy and its inherent fragility. Her succession, which relied on the pragmatic sanction, was contested by powerful neighbours and shaped by centuries of Habsburg intermarriage. Maria Theresa's life would illustrate the delicate balance between political necessity and the biological vulnerabilities embedded in her bloodline. She was a ruler born into expectation, whose personal circumstances could dictate the fate of an empire. Marriage alliances in smaller courts continued to ripple across Europe. In Italy, the various duchies and principalities relied on marital strategy to maintain autonomy and avoid being swallowed by larger powers. Yet intermarriage frequently produced fragile heirs, whose health or early deaths could destabilize political arrangements. Scandinavia faced similar dilemmas. Royal families intertwined across borders, with each union carrying potential benefits and risks. Fragile heirs were not just personal tragedies, they were catalysts for political manoeuvring, succession disputes, and diplomatic recalibration. The Bourbon dynasty in Spain also faced the realities of fragile succession. Philip V's children, while heirs to a powerful throne, were subject to intense scrutiny regarding health and legitimacy. The consequences of intermarriage and repeated dynastic planning became evident as health problems and infant mortality affected the line of succession. European courts monitored these developments closely, knowing that any weakness could shift alliances, invite intervention, or even trigger conflict. Fragile heirs were as powerful in shaping history as armies or treaties. Political strategy increasingly relied on careful observation of heirs. Courtiers, diplomats, and monarchs studied the temperament, health, and potential marriages of princes and princesses. Every royal birth became a geopolitical event. In Austria, France, and Spain, advisors meticulously tracked lineage and intermarriage consequences, aware that fragile heirs could directly influence policy, alliances, and even the outbreak of war. Dynastic planning was no longer a matter of prestige alone. It was survival at a continental scale. Religion intertwined with dynastic concerns in ways that magnified fragility. Catholic and Protestant divisions shaped marriage choices and succession claims, and the health or legitimacy of a royal heir could ignite religious tension as easily as political disputes. England, Spain, and various German states faced constant negotiation over religion and bloodlines, demonstrating how fragile heirs were pivotal not only to political strategy, but to ideological balance. Dynastic fragility intersected with faith, creating a complex web where personal and political vulnerabilities collided. The personal cost for royal children remained enormous. Every heir was raised under intense pressure to embody political stability, carry forward the family legacy, and produce the next generation. Illness, temperament, or failure was never just personal. It had ramifications for entire empires. The fragility of these individuals highlighted the tension at the heart of dynastic ambition. The more concentrated the bloodline, the greater the potential risk. History, in this sense, was shaped as much by human vulnerability as by strategy or ambition. Despite these challenges, dynastic marriages remained Europe's primary means of consolidating power. The Bourbons, Habsburgs, and other major houses continued to intermarry, carefully weighing political advantage against the biological risks they had observed for generations. Children of these unions were expected to navigate an impossible balance, carry the weight of history, survive the vulnerabilities of intermarriage, and produce heirs who would continue the cycle. Fragile bloodlines dictated not only succession, but the very stability of empires. By mid-century, Europe had developed a new awareness of the consequences of dynastic fragility. Courts were more cautious, advisors more vigilant, and marriages more calculated. Yet the fundamental paradox remained: no amount of strategy could eliminate the inherent vulnerabilities of human life. Even the most powerful dynasties were dependent on heirs whose health, temperament, and survival could determine the political fate of nations. The legacy of intermarriage and fragile bloodlines was both a source of strength and a constant vulnerability. High-stakes marriages became the defining feature of mid-18th century dynasties. Maria Theresa of Austria, for example, was not just an empress in waiting. She was a political instrument whose marriages for her children would define European alliances for decades. Her daughter, Marie Antoinette, would later become a symbol of this dynastic strategy. But even in Maria Theresa's era, the pressure on her children was immense. Each union was carefully calculated to secure borders, stabilize influence, and crucially produce heirs capable of continuing the fragile line. In France, Louis XV's marriages and those of his children were scrutinized for both political and biological implications. Infant mortality, illness, and the temperament of heirs shaped court decisions and determined the timing of future alliances. Courtiers and diplomats monitored births and health as closely as armies and trade agreements. The human fragility at the centre of these dynastic strategies dictated the rhythm of European politics. Every royal child represented both hope and risk, a potential stabiliser of power or the spark for instability. Spain faced similar pressures. Philip V's descendants were expected to navigate a world shaped by war, fragile alliances, and the legacies of intermarriage. Successive generations carried the burden of history, their health and survival determining whether dynasties could maintain influence or risk collapse. Political advisors constantly balanced the ambitions of monarchs against the unpredictable realities of human biology. Even the most brilliant strategy could be undone by the frailty of heirs, illustrating the tightrope that dynasties walked across Europe. Smaller courts were equally attentive to dynastic vulnerabilities. Italian principalities, Scandinavian kingdoms, and Eastern European duchies relied heavily on carefully arranged marriages. Yet fragile heirs, early deaths, or incapacitated rulers introduced unpredictability that could undo alliances or invite foreign intervention. Even a minor health issue in a royal child could cascade into political upheaval, showing that dynastic fragility affected more than the family. It shaped regional and continental stability. Religion intersected with these dynastic pressures in powerful ways. Protestant and Catholic divisions influenced marriage arrangements, succession claims, and the legitimacy of heirs. England's royal succession crises, for example, were entwined with religious identity, and continental states carefully considered the faith of potential heirs in every political calculation. Fragile heirs were at the heart of this interplay, as illness, death, or contested legitimacy could ignite religious tension and provoke international consequences. Political intrigue remained rampant. Advisors, courtiers, and foreign powers constantly sought opportunities to manipulate outcomes, using the health and temperament of heirs as leverage. Internal court factions thrived on instability, capitalizing on every weakness or misfortune in the royal family. Fragile heirs became both symbols and instruments of power, demonstrating that dynastic strategy was inseparable from human vulnerability. Every royal decision had far-reaching consequences, shaping alliances, triggering disputes, and sometimes igniting war. The personal lives of royal children illustrate the immense pressures of dynastic strategy. From birth, they were trained to fulfill the expectations of power, diplomacy, and continuity. Illness or early death was not just a private tragedy. It could destabilize empires, provoke conflicts, or shift the balance of power across Europe. Dynasties, though outwardly powerful, were internally fragile, reliant on heirs who carried the weight of generations and the unpredictable consequences of intermarriage. The long-term effects of these fragile bloodlines were visible by the mid-18th century. Europe had entered a period where political stability, international relations, and even domestic governance were contingent on the survival and capability of heirs. Maria Theresa's meticulous arrangements, Louis XV's carefully monitored offspring, and Philip V's succession planning all reflect a continent deeply aware of human fragility. Dynastic ambition could expand influence and consolidate power, but it could never remove the vulnerabilities inherent in the people who carried that power forward. By this stage, the interconnection between dynastic fragility, political stability, and personal consequence had become undeniable. Wars, treaties, marriages, and alliances were all influenced by the condition and capability of royal heirs. Europe's royal houses were living proof that political power and human vulnerability were inseparable. Fragile bloodlines dictated the rhythm of diplomacy, the outcome of succession, and the trajectory of empires. Every decision, every birth, and every death mattered in ways that extended far beyond individual families. Even as dynasties adapted to these realities, the fundamental tension remained. The more concentrated the bloodline, the greater the potential fragility. Heirs carried not just the expectations of their families, but the fate of nations, illustrating that dynastic planning, no matter how brilliant, was always balanced against human limitations. The mid-18th century was therefore a period defined by both immense power and delicate vulnerability, a world where fragile heirs shaped empires, alliances, and the very course of history. The consequences of fragile bloodlines were never confined to the palace. They reverberated across entire nations. When heirs were sickly, childless, or mentally unprepared, political systems strained to compensate. France, Austria, and Spain each faced moments where fragile heirs threatened to unravel alliances painstakingly built over decades. Diplomats and monarchs were constantly alert, ready to intervene, adjust treaties, or manipulate succession to protect their own interests. Dynastic fragility was no longer just a family concern, it was a continental one. In France, the early deaths of children and health crises among royal heirs created a sense of urgency at Versailles. Nobles and ministers moved with caution, aware that instability at the top could spark unrest or embolden rival powers. Succession planning became an ongoing process, with advisors monitoring every birth, illness, and marital negotiation. Even minor setbacks had ripple effects, influencing domestic policy, foreign diplomacy, and military readiness. Fragile heirs were, quite literally, the fulcrum on which entire states balanced. Austria's experience mirrored this tension. Maria Theresa's succession, though ultimately successful, was contested and fraught with anxiety. Her children were instruments of dynastic strategy, but their health and survival were critical to the Habsburg legacy. Advisors had to balance the ambitions of other European powers against the realities of fragile heirs, often navigating crises where personal vulnerability and political calculation collided. The Austrian court became a case study in how fragile bloodlines could shape the course of empires. Spain's Bourbon dynasty faced similar pressures. Philip V's children were watched not just for legitimacy, but for their ability to stabilise the kingdom in the aftermath of war. Every marriage, every birth, and every death carried immense significance, influencing alliances, treaties, and domestic policy. Dynastic fragility shaped decisions at the highest level, illustrating that the survival of heirs was a matter of state. Political planning could not eliminate the vulnerabilities inherent in human life, and every unexpected illness or mortality event introduced uncertainty into the delicate balance of power. Smaller courts, while less visible, were equally affected. Italian principalities, Scandinavian kingdoms, and Eastern European duchies relied heavily on careful dynastic management to maintain autonomy. Fragile heirs could prompt internal unrest or provide opportunities for foreign influence, proving that even minor dynasties were not immune to the consequences of intermarriage and biological vulnerability. Across Europe, the fragility of heirs shaped diplomacy, military planning, and domestic governance in ways that were often as consequential as major wars. Religion continued to amplify these challenges. Protestant and Catholic divides made marriage, succession, and legitimacy central issues in politics. England's succession crises, for example, combined the fragility of heirs with religious conflict, creating instability that reverberated across the continent. In Catholic Spain and Austria, dynastic vulnerability intertwined with the need to maintain alliances and legitimacy in the eyes of both domestic subjects and foreign powers. Fragile heirs, therefore, were not merely biological concerns. They were deeply entwined with ideology, loyalty, and the perception of legitimacy. The human dimension of dynastic fragility was undeniable. Royal children grew up under immense pressure, expected to embody the stability of empires while navigating the vulnerabilities of their own bodies and minds. Illness, mortality, or incapacity was never just a personal matter. It could provoke succession crises, incite rebellions, and alter international relations. Dynasties, while outwardly imposing and seemingly invincible, were internally fragile, with the future of empires resting on the well-being of a few individuals. Political intrigue thrived on these vulnerabilities. Courtiers, advisors, and foreign powers constantly sought leverage, knowing that a sickly prince or childless king could create opportunities for influence or territorial gain. Fragile heirs were both assets and liabilities, symbols of continuity and potential sources of chaos. Diplomacy, war and policy were shaped as much by biology and personal circumstance as by strategy and ambition. History itself pivoted on the precarious balance between human fragility and dynastic planning. By mid-century, Europe's royal families had internalized these lessons. Courts were more cautious, marriages more calculated, and advisors more vigilant. Yet the underlying paradox persisted. The more concentrated the bloodline, the greater the potential fragility. Heirs carried the weight of dynasties, empires, and alliances, illustrating that dynastic ambition was inseparable from human vulnerability. Europe's political landscape remained a delicate equilibrium, constantly influenced by the fates of those born into power. Fragile heirs shaped not just succession, but the very rhythm of European history. Wars, diplomacy, and domestic governance were all contingent on their survival and ability to fulfill dynastic expectations. From Versailles to Vienna, Madrid to smaller principalities, the interplay of ambition and vulnerability dictated the course of nations. Dynasties could expand, influence, and consolidate power, but they could never fully control the human element that remained at their centre. By the latter half of the 18th century, Europe had learned, often painfully, that dynastic fragility could shape the course of entire nations. Fragile heirs, contested successions, and carefully orchestrated marriages had left their mark on the continent. Royal families, despite vast wealth and armies, remained profoundly vulnerable. their power intimately tied to the health, temperament, and survival of their children. The legacy of these bloodlines was a reminder that ambition and strategy alone could not secure a dynasty. Human fragility was always a determining factor. Maria Theresa's children exemplified the delicate balance of dynastic strategy. Her daughters were married into powerful European houses to solidify alliances, while her sons were groomed to inherit and defend her empire. Yet, each birth carried both hope and risk. Infant mortality and fragile health were constants, and advisors continuously weighed the political and biological consequences of each marriage. The Habsburgs' careful planning illustrates how intertwined strategy and vulnerability had become. A single misstep could unravel years of preparation, influence, and regional stability. In France, the Bourbon line similarly grappled with the long-term effects of fragile bloodlines. Louis XV's descendants faced scrutiny over their health and legitimacy, and even minor illnesses could trigger anxiety among advisors and foreign observers. Dynastic fragility dictated alliances, diplomatic negotiations, and domestic policy. Versailles became a place where human vulnerability and political calculation intersected constantly, showing that the greatest threat to empires often came from within the family itself. Spain's Bourbon heirs mirrored this pattern. Philip V's descendants were expected to carry forward a kingdom shaped by war and fragile alliances. Marriages were carefully arranged to consolidate power, but infant mortality and fragile health remained unpredictable. The fates of these heirs determined the stability of the Spanish crown, influenced relations with France, Austria, and other European powers, and even affected colonial governance overseas. Dynastic fragility was no longer just a family concern. It had continental and global implications. Smaller European states continued to navigate the delicate web of dynastic politics. Italian principalities, Scandinavian kingdoms, and eastern duchies relied heavily on marriage and succession for stability. Fragile heirs were both a source of hope and a potential crisis. Any vulnerability could invite foreign intervention, provoke rebellion, or disrupt alliances. Even in these smaller courts, the interplay between human fragility and political strategy shaped the trajectory of entire regions. Religion remained intertwined with dynastic strategy. Protestant and Catholic divisions dictated marriage choices, succession legitimacy, and alliances. England, Spain, and the German states all experienced the consequences of fragile heirs magnified by religious tension. A single disputed birth or untimely death could ignite conflict, shift loyalties, or alter the religious landscape of a kingdom. Dynastic fragility was inseparable from faith, politics, and the legitimacy of rulers. The human cost of maintaining dynastic power was immense. Royal children carried the weight of expectations, surviving under intense scrutiny and navigating pressures that extended far beyond their personal lives. Illness, early death, or incapacity could reshape history, proving that dynasties were powerful in appearance but perpetually vulnerable in reality. Human frailty dictated not only succession, but also the stability and fate of entire empires. Long-term, the legacies of these fragile bloodlines shaped the future of Europe. By the late 18th century, monarchs were increasingly cautious, advisors more vigilant, and marriages more calculated. Dynastic fragility had taught rulers that power was conditional, not absolute. The intricate web of alliances, marriages, and succession planning reflected a continent deeply aware of how vulnerable even the most prominent families could be. This period also set the stage for later upheavals. The vulnerabilities and pressures experienced by heirs during the 18th century would resonate in the following decades, influencing the French Revolution, Habsburg reforms, and Bourbon political strategy. Dynastic fragility was a constant undercurrent, shaping not only immediate politics but the long-term evolution of European power structures. History was built on human lives, and the consequences of fragile bloodlines extended far beyond individual families, echoing through wars, treaties, and revolutions. In the end, the story of fragile dynasties is a story of human ambition constrained by human limitation. The most powerful families in Europe, despite armies, wealth, and centuries of planning, were dependent on the health and survival of their heirs. Political strategy, intermarriage, and alliance building could amplify power, but they could not eliminate the unpredictability of life. Dynastic fragility was both a vulnerability and a defining feature of European history, a constant reminder that even empires rest on the shoulders of the fragile. Europe by the late 18th century was a mosaic of power, influence, and fragility. While the great dynasties, the Bourbons, Habsburgs, and Romanovs, had dominated history for centuries, the smaller houses were beginning to assert influence in subtle but profound ways. These minor families, often overlooked in grand narratives, leveraged marriages, alliances, and occasionally sheer opportunism to shape political landscapes. Yet, even as they rose, the fragility of heirs remained a persistent theme, proving that no dynasty, great or small, was immune to the whims of biology and circumstance. In Germany, the numerous principalities were often ruled by lines that had survived through careful marriages and strategic alliances rather than outright conquest. Families like the Wettins, the Hohenzollerns, and the Welfs understood that political survival depended on producing heirs who could continue the lineage while navigating Europe's complex web of treaties and rivalries. Fragile heirs meant that these houses had to act cautiously, balancing ambition with the awareness that one sickly child or contested succession could undo generations of meticulous planning. Italy's patchwork of duchies and city-states offers another compelling example. Houses such as the Savoys in Piedmont or the Este in Modena relied heavily on intermarriage with more prominent families to maintain autonomy and influence. Their success often hinged on producing healthy heirs capable of representing the house abroad. A fragile birth or untimely death could invite intervention from France, Austria, or Spain, altering the course of a region without a single battle fought. Dynastic fragility, once again, demonstrated its quiet but immense power in shaping Europe's political chessboard. Even in the Scandinavian kingdoms, where geography and smaller populations limited military power, dynastic fragility had outsized consequences. Marriages were crafted to secure loyalty and reinforce legitimacy, often linking Scandinavian houses with German or French dynasties. Every birth, every heir, and every unexpected death could trigger questions of legitimacy and succession. Monarchs, ministers, and foreign diplomats monitored these developments closely, knowing that fragile heirs could destabilize kingdoms and invite foreign interference. France and Spain, though powerful, were not immune to the subtle influence of minor houses. Marriages between lesser nobility and the royal family often served as conduits for power and influence. These alliances could produce heirs whose health or personality might strengthen or destabilize the broader dynastic network. Even the smallest miscalculation, a frail child, a disputed inheritance, could reverberate across courts and capitals, reminding all that fragility was the hidden constant behind the grandeur of European royalty. Court intrigue remained a central feature of dynastic politics. Advisors, courtiers, and foreign agents watched every development, ready to capitalize on weakness. Fragile heirs were simultaneously vulnerable and powerful. Their existence shaped negotiations, alliances, and disputes. Whether through arranged marriages, inheritance disputes, or subtle manipulation, minor houses leveraged fragility to navigate a Europe dominated by giants. Their influence, though often understated, proved that even small players could sway the course of history when human weakness intersected with opportunity. Religion, too, continued to influence dynastic calculations. Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox divisions dictated marriage arrangements and succession strategies. Fragile heirs often complicated these dynamics. A sickly prince in a Catholic court might jeopardize an alliance with a Protestant neighbour, While the early death of an heir could provoke disputes over religious legitimacy, Europe's minor and major dynasties alike had to negotiate the delicate interplay between faith, biology, and power, demonstrating that fragility was both a personal and political challenge. The personal toll on royal children was immense. By this stage in history, European heirs were trained not only in diplomacy and governance, but in the art of surviving scrutiny and expectation. Illness, temperament, and mortality remained central concerns. Families that appeared invincible from the outside were internally fragile, their fortunes dependent on the survival and health of heirs. The story of these dynasties illustrates that history was shaped not just by wars and treaties, but by the human fragility at the centre of power. The cumulative effect of centuries of dynastic fragility became evident in the late 18th century. Wars, rebellions, and political crises had demonstrated time and again that empires rested on the unpredictable lives of heirs. Even as the major houses consolidated power, minor houses exploited openings created by fragility, reminding Europe that vulnerability existed at every level of the aristocracy. The patterns of intermarriage, succession disputes, and fragile heirs had created a continent-wide system where human weakness dictated the rhythm of politics and diplomacy. The long-term legacy of these fragile bloodlines is striking. By the time the 18th century drew to a close, the political map of Europe had been shaped not only by conquest and diplomacy, but by the cumulative effect of human frailty. Dynastic fragility had influenced every aspect of governance, from succession laws to marriage policies, from internal court intrigue to continental alliances. Royal families, great and small, had learned that the power of a house was inseparable from the vulnerabilities of its heirs. History, in this sense, was a story written as much in the bodies of princes and princesses as in the decrees of kings. As the century ended, the pattern was clear. Dynastic ambition would continue to define Europe, but always in tension with human limitation. The Bourbons, Habsburgs, Romanovs, and the minor houses alike were shaped by the same paradox. They wielded immense influence, yet the survival and capability of fragile heirs remained their greatest concern. Every political manoeuvre, alliance, or marital arrangement had to account for the reality that human fragility could overturn even the most brilliant strategy. Ultimately, the story of Europe's dynasties is a story of resilience, strategy, and vulnerability. The grand palaces, the treaties, the armies, and the alliances were impressive, but the lives of fragile heirs determined the ultimate success or failure of these efforts. Minor houses and major dynasties alike were bound by the same rules. Ambition amplified by careful planning, yet always constrained by the human condition. The rise and fall of influence, the shifting alliances, and the enduring legacies of these families all point to a fundamental truth. The history of Europe is inseparable from the frailty of its rulers. By the time we reach the modern era, the echoes of these fragile dynasties are still visible. Borders, alliances, and institutions shaped by centuries of succession, intermarriage, and fragile heirs continue to influence the continent. The story of Europe's royal houses reminds us that power, no matter how grand, is always vulnerable to the human element. Dynastic ambition may endure, but it is forever tempered by the unpredictable realities of life, health, and inheritance. Europe's royal families, major and minor alike, leave behind a legacy that is as human as it is historic. The grandeur, intrigue, and ambition of centuries were inseparable from the fragility of the individuals at the centre of it all. From the mighty Bourbons to the cunning minor houses, the survival and vulnerability of heir-shaped wars, treaties, and the very trajectory of nations. In the end, history is not only written in battlefields and palaces, it is written in the delicate lives of those who carried dynasties forward, fragile, yet immensely consequential. And so, the story concludes. A continent defined by ambition, shaped by strategy, and forever intertwined with the fragile bloodlines that determined the fate of Europe. The rise and fall of houses, the subtle influence of minor families, and the enduring consequences of fragile heirs remind us that power and vulnerability have always walked hand in hand. Europe's dynasties were great not only because of their might, but because of the very human fragility that made their stories so compelling, dramatic, and unforgettable. And there you have it, the full journey through Europe's most fascinating and fragile dynasties, major houses, minor players, and the human lives that shaped centuries of history. From the grand ambitions of the Bourbons and Habsburgs to the subtle manoeuvres of smaller houses, we've seen how power, strategy, and sheer human fragility intertwined to rewrite borders, trigger wars, and define the fate of nations. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Europe's royal intrigues, fragile heirs, and dynastic drama, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps support the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story like this, where history comes alive with all its twists, scandals, and unexpected turns. Thanks for sticking with me on this journey through time. Until next time, keep exploring, stay curious, and good night from the heart of history.